Relations Committee will come to order. If it's not objectionable to members, I think we'll begin the hearing. And as soon as we have a quorum, go ahead and try to pass out the nominees that are before us. We thank our witnesses for being here. We thank Ambassador Cadenow, Acting Assistant Secretary Harvey, and General Cooper for joining us today. This is the committee's second hearing on security assistance in just over a year, but it's an issue that has been raised during many of our other meetings. This kind of assistance is an investment in our own security. We help ourselves by helping other nations police their own neighborhoods. Which nations we help and how we help them are crucial foreign policy decisions. Since the 1960s, the law provides that the Secretary of State, under the direction of the President, has the responsibility for the continuous supervision and general direction of economic assistance, military assistance, and training programs. We need to be clear on that because our security demands that we work across agency lines to develop coherent security assistance programs that serve our interests and those of our partners. While the Defense Department has long played an important role in this area, since 9/11 that role has grown enormously in size and scope. We cannot tackle the real challenges if we are fighting turf wars within other bureaucracies. And while teamwork is necessary, it's not enough. We need clear goals and a way to keep track of how we are doing. Between state and DOD, we're spending about $18 billion a year on security sector assistance. As General Hooper said the other day, this is not a pickup game. We need professionals. Last year, Congress consolidated many of the narrow and overlapping authorities on the defense side and has given the Defense Department a more flexible and global train and equip authority. I was pleased that the measure signed into law requires the concurrence of the Secretary of State for these activities and encourages both departments to jointly develop and plan such programs. I would like to hear from our OSD and state witnesses on the question of concurrence versus coordination as it pertains to security cooperation activities already in progress, such as the Counter ISIS Train and Equip. At the State Department, significant security assistant roles are held by 4 different functional bureaus, each with their own budget, plus all of the regional bureaus. And these bureaus report down through 4 different secretaries, making it difficult to see who's in charge. Under this current organizational structure, I have concerns about the department's ability to manage its own programs while also reviewing and shaping DoD efforts. I hope the redesign plan will address this matter, and any insight our witnesses could share into that process would be greatly appreciated. We've made some progress since we last gathered on this topic, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on how the State Department and the Department of Defense will continue their efforts to make these important programs work as well as possible. With that, I ask our distinguished ranking member, my friend, if he would like to make introductory comments.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really do believe this is one of our most important hearings we've had this year, and I thank you very much for doing this because we all understand that we are talking about our national security. The U.S. law mandates that the Secretary of State supervise and oversee all foreign assistance and service that U.S. foreign policy. All military and security-related assistance to foreign governments and personnel, including military-to-military programs, are part of the U.S. foreign assistance and must serve U.S. foreign policy. The Department of Defense has been expanding its security assistance activities by leaps and bounds over the last 16 years. Most of these activities is to build foreign countries' defense capabilities are necessary and important. We acknowledge that. My chief concern, however, is that DoD is setting up an essentially parallel security assistance structure without sufficient State Department oversight, input, and coordination. Combine this with the current administration's profoundly unwise proposal to slash the Department of State's budget, oblique reorganization efforts, and increasing loss of experienced personnel, and one could easily see a scenario in which the Department of Defense could become the dominant source of U.S. security assistance. This shift from the state to DoD could not only result in dueling foreign policies, it could also send a fundamental message that the United States considers security relationships over all other U.S. foreign policy objectives or concerns, including human rights or good governance. Last year's National Defense Authorization Act expanded the ability of the Department of State to be involved in the actual formation of DoD assistance projects, in addition to requiring the department's concurrence in their executions. Congress sent a clear message that DoD and state must work more closely on security assistance projects earlier in the process and to a far greater extent than previously. It was good to see this. We saw that the members of both the Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committee understood the importance of this coordination, and the lead from the Department of State in the National Defense Authorization Act, in fact, did carry that out. I hope we will hear today that we are doing better coordination and cooperation between the two departments, and that has been greatly increased. And from what I've heard just from the conversations, there's reason to believe that that cooperation exists. I also have deep concerns about various aspects of our security assistance, especially how arms sales are used to support our foreign policy. For example, I'm concerned about the previously proposed arms sales to our increasingly problematic NATO ally, Turkey. I oppose the sale of semi-automatic pistols to the Erdogan bodyguard force, the same force that viciously beat peaceful protesters in Washington, D.C. I am pleased that the sale was effectively canceled last week, although I remain perplexed that given the gruesome videos of the incident, it took 4 months for the administration to cancel the sale. More recently, Turkey purchased a Russian anti-aircraft system despite warnings from the U.S. and other NATO countries. I believe this is sanctionable under the new Russia Sanctions Act, and I've asked the Secretary of State to review this. I would be interested to hear what, if any, reviews of the U.S.-Turkey security relationships are underway, including assistance and arms sales. I look forward to discussing our security relationship with Nigeria. I support a close and supportive security relationship to defeat Boko Haram, provided that the Nigerian forces we support are in compliance with the Leahy laws and broader human rights standards. We have yet to see any accountability from Nigeria for the December 2015 Zaria massacre by government forces, or for the apparently accidental air bombing this January of the Ran refugee camp in which over 200 people were killed. First and foremost, the U.S. should prioritize assisting Nigerian military with the necessary training, including human rights training, improved intelligence, and targeting capabilities, and the ability to conduct an integrated military operation to combat the Boko Haram threat. Given the Ran incident, I do not see how we can be confident that the precision-guided munitions and new aircraft provided to the Nigerian military will not be involved in future accidental civilian casualties. I encourage the state and defense departments to formulate a comprehensive strategy to address the core weaknesses in the Nigerian military so that we may better assist them in their fight against Boko Haram. I hope you can provide me, the witnesses, with assurances that such strategy is underway. I would also like to hear details how U.S. security assistance is being used to support U.S. foreign policy and security objectives in the Middle East, including the resolution of the current internal GCC dispute and to promote the political resolution of the Yemen conflict. I applaud the leadership of our chairman on that issue. Finally, I understand that the Department of State wants to move lethal small arms and light weapons off the U.S. munitions list to the Department of Commerce, an action that will effectively remove these sales from congressional oversight. I'm deeply concerned about that. The proposal includes semi-automatic pistols, assault weapons, and even military sniper rifles. As you know, I raised concerns about 2 proposed small arms sales over the last year: the sale of pistols to the Turkish bodyguards and 27,000 assault rifles to the Philippine National Police, which continues to summarily execute its own civilians. If these weapons go to commerce, the Congress and this committee will lose all oversight. Had this proposal been done earlier, both of these sales could have gone through. I, along with Senators Feinstein and Leahy, recently sent a letter to the Secretary of State opposing this unwise move. I also proposed an amendment to the NDAA to maintain congressional oversight and disapproval, and I may pursue this measure on other legislative vehicles. So, Mr. Chairman, I think we have a lot to talk about today. It's certainly one of the principal responsibilities of this committee, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses.
Well, thank you for those comments. You see us looking around. We're looking for an 11th senator, and so I think. Okay, it's my understanding one senator's in the back and he'll step in. So if we could, I'd like to adjourn the hearing briefly and start the business meeting and hopefully move out. Actually, we have our 11th here. Business meeting, the Foreign Relations Committee will come to order. Consider a number of nominations today. I want to thank my colleagues for helping the committee work through these nominations in an appropriate fashion and to allow us to take these steps forward. Senator Cardin, do you have any comments you'd like to make?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Working with our staffs and all the members of our committee, I support all these nominees. I do want to make just a very brief comment about Mr. Huntsman, Government Huntsman, the ambassador nominee to Russia. We listened to a lot of nominees before this committee, and a lot of them are very well qualified, and certainly Governor Huntsman is one of those individuals that's very well qualified. But few have answered the questions with the clarity that he did, and his commitment to carry out the type of strength for our values and our relationship with Russia. So I'm enthusiastically supporting his nominee and hope that we can get him to Moscow as soon as possible.
I couldn't agree more. I thought it was an outstanding testimony, one of the best we've heard, although we've heard numbers of very good ones, and I look forward to him being in Moscow. Any other comments? What I'd like to ask then is that we entertain a motion to approve all of the nominations on block by voice vote. If anyone wants to register a negative, they're glad to do. They're able to do so. But I'd like a motion to unblock, move the Honorable John Huntsman to be Ambassador to Russia, Mr. Wes Mitchell to be the Assistant Secretary for European and Eurasian Affairs, Mr. Justin Ciborel to be Ambassador to Bahrain, Mr. Stephen Dowd to be the U.S. Director of African Development Bank. It's been moved. Is there a second? All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Anyone want to be reported as a negative? With that, that'll complete our committee business. We ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes. Without objection, so ordered. And with that, without objection, the committee will stand adjourned from the business meeting. We'll now move to the hearing. Our first witness is Acting Assistant Secretary for Political and Military Affairs, Tina Cadenow. From the State Department, we thank you for being back before us. Look forward to your testimony. Our second witness is Mr. Todd Harvey, Acting Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy, Plans, and Capabilities in the Office of Secretary of Defense. Our third witness is General Charles Hooper, Director of the Defense Security Cooperation Agency. We want to thank all of you for being here. If you could summarize your testimony in about 5 minutes without objection, your written testimony will be entered into the record. And if you would just begin in the order introduced, we'd appreciate it. Again, thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cardin, distinguished members of the committee. It is my honor and privilege to come before the committee today to discuss the processes and the methods through which the U.S. government provides security sector assistance to our partners overseas. I'm particularly grateful to be joined in this discussion by my colleagues and my friends, Acting Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy, Plans, and Capabilities, Todd Harvey, and Lieutenant General Hooper from the Defense Security Cooperation Agency. The security assistance effort is a U.S. government-wide endeavor. As such, the Department of State interacts collaboratively each and every day with the Department of Defense in order to formulate and implement critical aspects of our assistance policy. We also work together with you, the U.S. Congress, and notably with the members and the staff of this august committee. Security assistance is, in the end, a tool of foreign policy, and the committee's oversight of that assistance is both welcomed and deeply appreciated by the State Department as an essential element of effective foreign policy making. Finally, although not part of our U.S. government apparatus per se, we work exceptionally closely with our foreign partners, with whom we cultivate a critical set of relationships, and whose growing military and defense capability matters from the standpoint of achieving vital U.S. national security objectives, whether encountering terrorism, deterring aggression by our mutual adversaries overseas, or pushing back against other emergent threats. Though it's now some years ago, President Reagan's 1982 National Security Strategy made the clear and very compelling case that security assistance programs are one of the most cost-effective means that we have of enhancing the security of the United States. Those words, I would argue, are as true today as they were back in 1982, although the statutes and the processes through which American security assistance is carried out have changed significantly since that time. Since 2001, in particular, we've seen a reorientation of U.S. security assistance towards addressing specific threats, often construed in a largely military-related construct. For example, funds and authorities have been aimed at helping our allies and friends address security challenges in Eastern Europe, in North Africa and the Maghreb, in the South China Sea, and elsewhere. But at its core, security assistance is and must remain an element of our larger foreign policy. It should be regarded as an important, but by no means exclusive tool in our toolkit of measures as we think about the proper balance of goals and objectives in any country or region of the world. Given the unquestioned relationship between security assistance and foreign policy, the Department of State must continue to play a crucial role in the provision and the coordination of such assistance across the U.S. government. State works, I hope, diligently to ensure that all security sector assistance strategically advances our foreign policy objectives, that it advances U.S. goals in light of broader diplomatic and defense relationships, that everything the many and varied entities of the U.S. government are doing in the foreign security sector advances a single coherent strategy, that any investments we make in foreign security forces advance both security and political purposes, that such efforts take into account the political balance between civil and military institutions in the recipient country, that they're based on mutual, enduring interests between our countries, and that they do not cause long-term unintended effects in the country or in the region. That's certainly the case as we go about the business of implementing the State Department's Title 22 authorities. It's equally the case, however, as we fulfill the State Department's congressionally mandated roles of coordination, concurrence, and joint planning and development with regard to the Title 10 authorities that fall under the purview of the Department of Defense. That includes, signally, as the chairman mentioned, the new Section 333 authority that was mandated by the FY17 NDAA. Section 333 stipulates specifically in legislation that assistance should not only be provided with the concurrence of the Secretary of State, but also be jointly formulated by the two departments. While we had certainly made some strides in that direction previously with the cooperation of our DoD colleagues, Section 333 marks a significant step forward from where we have been before. I believe this is a trend that will become even more critical in a time of resource challenges, but it makes sense from any standpoint as we seek to ensure the greatest efficiency and effectiveness possible for our U.S. security assistance. In essence, to get the greatest bang for our assistance buck. There's no question that this is both where the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense want us to go. Indeed, at the direction of our two secretaries, we have now established a new state DoD Security Sector Assistance Steering Committee to oversee an intensification of enhanced joint planning. I co-chair this committee together with Todd here to my right, and the committee is now engaged in developing a process for fiscal year 2018 military assistance planning that will enable state and DoD to validate our security assistance requirements in keeping with our administration's priorities, to look carefully at how best to optimize DoD Section 333 military assistance and state FMF resources towards that end, to leverage each department's expertise and authorities, and to reinforce our respective requests to the Congress. In the longer term, we hope to strategically integrate state and DoD planning and resourcing processes for an even wider range of security assistance efforts, including by synchronizing our budget requests and rationalizing and refining the use of each department's authorities. I want to thank you again for taking up this absolutely essential issue and finding the time today to address it thoughtfully. I can't stress enough how appreciative I am for the tremendous partnership and the goodwill of the two gentlemen sitting beside me here today, as well as of many of your staff who so patiently work through these very complex issues together with us. I ask that my written statement, as you said, be accepted for the record, and I very much look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harvey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cardin, distinguished members of the committee. Appreciate the opportunity to appear before you here today with my colleagues from State Department and Defense Security Cooperation Agency. As you underscored at the outset, the Department of Defense conducts a broad range of security assistance activities globally. DoD authorities and resources in the security assistance sphere have expanded to meet new and evolving security challenges over the past 10 to 15 years, certainly since the first DoD Train and Equip Authority, the original Section 1206, was passed by Congress in 2005. Even as DoD's direct involvement in the security assistance arena has increased, the Defense Department has sought to work closely with our State Department counterparts to identify, formulate, and implement partner security capacity building programs. The Department of Defense strongly endorses and supports the State Department's leading role in not only setting the administration's course in foreign policy, but defining the shape and purpose of our U.S. foreign assistance efforts, including security assistance initiatives. No official outside the State Department has been a stronger proponent for reinforcing states' primacy in performing these roles and having adequate resources to execute them than Secretary of Defense Mattis. He recognizes more than most that success in addressing the nation's threats requires an integrated team effort where DoD's and states' resource allocation processes are tightly linked and mutually reinforcing. Most DoD security assistance programs are bounded by statutory obligations to jointly develop and plan their activities in conjunction with State Department and to secure Secretary of State concurrence before implementing them. The Department of Defense recognizes the importance, even the essential imperative, of conducting business in this way. In our government, no department has the luxury of pursuing uncoordinated efforts, especially given finite resources and growing threats. While it may not have always been so, I'd venture to say that currently all DoD security assistance programs are shaped and approved at some level, and often at multiple levels, by the State Department, from the country team to the regional functional bureaus at Maine State to the Secretary himself. One factor to keep in mind as we consider the U.S. security assistance enterprise, DoD should not replicate the functions of the State Department and vice versa. While some overlap in authorities and resources provides useful flexibility in tackling difficult security threats, the two departments cannot and should not seek to recreate or mirror each other's security assistance programs exactly. DoD and the State Department can work toward the same objectives and ends, but contribute to those ends through different ways or lines of effort that reflect their distinct histories, missions, and capabilities. Many of DoD's activities have grown out of pressing operational needs identified by commanders on the ground, which complement but differ from the broader political and diplomatic imperatives that often inform State Department security assistance activities. Those distinctions have admittedly blurred on the margins over the years, but can still be seen in the underlying rationale for core programs for each department. In the past 2 years, DoD has worked closely with its oversight committees to reform the way we approach security assistance by consolidating authorities, combining resources, pursuing workforce reform, and improving evaluation efforts. Why is this important? Because it infuses DoD efforts with greater discipline, helping guard against mission creep, and giving us the tools to identify and jettison ineffectual projects as soon as possible. These efforts also allow DoD to speak with a more unified voice in collaborating with State Department so that we can ensure that DoD security assistance actors adhere to guidance resulting from collective decisions made at senior levels of the two departments. As Ambassador Cade now indicated, a tangible marker of the commitment to work even more closely together is represented by Secretary Mattis and Secretary Tillerson's decision and direction that the two departments form and regularly convene a Security Sector Assistance Steering Committee that sets security assistance priorities in this field and synchronizes our investments to ensure that we don't duplicate efforts on one hand, nor inadvertently create gaps or seams between our programs on the other. Finally, I would simply reiterate that DoD is committed to working productively and harmoniously with State Department in this space. DoD has no desire nor intent to supplant State because we recognize that the multidimensional challenges we face, where security, governance, stabilization, and development all intermingle, require the full and integrated efforts of both departments if we are to succeed in achieving our security goals globally. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I stand by for your questions.
Thank you very much. Lieutenant General.
Chairman Corker, Ranking Member Cardin, and distinguished members of the committee. I'm pleased to be here today to share my thoughts on the role of the Defense Security Cooperation Agency, or DSCA, in the management, execution, and reform of security cooperation. As you know, security cooperation includes a wide range of activities such as transfers of defense articles and services, military-to-military exercises, ministerial advising, and train and equip programs using both Title X and Title 22 authorities to deliver a full spectrum of capabilities to our partners. DSCA has traditionally focused on the execution of Title 22 authorized programs such as foreign military sales, or FMS, funded by partner nations themselves, and foreign military financing funded by the Department of State. As a result of the legislative mandates in the fiscal year 2017 National Defense Authorization Act, however, DSCA is now responsible for implementing broader supervision of Title X security cooperations programs that are funded and executed by the Department of Defense, such as train and equip, humanitarian assistance, and defense institution building, to name but a few. DSCA plays a critical role in the nexus of diplomacy, policy, and program execution, working closely with our counterparts throughout DoD, in particular OSD policy, and also working with the interagency, and especially with the Department of State colleagues in Ambassador Cadenau's bureau, and of course the members of Congress and their staffs. In this role, we aim to align and integrate policy and operational requirements to provide innovative security cooperation solutions that benefit both our foreign partners and the United States. As Ambassador Cadenau and Mr. Harvey have noted, our programs build relationships that directly support U.S. security interests, develop allied and partner military capabilities, and provide U.S. forces with peacetime and contingency access. It is important to note, though, this access is not just geographical. It is an opportunity to build personal relationships which underpin our national security and foreign policy. One of my main focus areas at DSCA is to ensure we continue to cultivate effective and transparent relationships, not only between our defense and state counterparts, but with partner nations, private industry, and other influencers throughout the security cooperation process. Over the past few years, in close collaboration with OSD policy and the State Department, DSCA has begun to implement a robust set of initiatives addressing security cooperation challenges, in particular those associated with foreign military sales. Today, our partners are expecting more deliveries on accelerated timelines, and international competition in the defense trade is increasing. The majority of FMS cases are shepherded through the process relatively quickly. A small number, however, may take more time as the interagency and Congress engage in a deliberate review to ensure that the necessary statutory and policy criteria are met. Despite this, the United States remains the global security cooperation partner of choice. We deliver not only the most effective defensive systems to our partners, but we also ensure a total package approach that includes the provision of training, maintenance, sustainment to achieve a full spectrum capability. While improvements to the FMS process are necessary, they are not sufficient to make certain that we best utilize all of the security cooperation tools at our disposal. The FY17 NDAA put forth a number of significant reforms to enhance flexibility, transparency, oversight, and management of programs and resources, professionalize the security cooperation workforce, and improve the alignment of security cooperation activities with defensive strategies. Together with the FMS improvement initiatives, these new authorities provide us with a unique opportunity to transform security cooperation into a more strategic U.S. national security tool. Work on these reforms is well underway, and we must continue to harmonize our efforts across DoD as well as the interagency. We must allow for open dialogue respecting all perspectives, while at the same time taking advantage of the momentum we have to achieve the reform mandates in a timely manner. For the last 70 years, security cooperation has been the pillar of U.S. foreign policy. We must not, however, rest on our laurels. Today, the convergence of congressional mandates with the Department's emphasis on strengthening our partners is a call to action. We must seize this opportunity to fortify our status as a security cooperation partner of choice. Thank you.
Thank you all for your testimony. With that, I'll turn to Senator Cardin to begin questions.
Well, again, thank you for being here. Thank you for your service. And it's certainly encouraging to hear your conversations about how the collaborative process is working. I want to focus, if I might, on how you're using that collaborative efforts and programming to deal with advancing human rights. The Congress at times put conditionalities on our security assistance programs. We're pretty specific as to what we expect before the release of funds. But can you tell me specifically where your strategies are in using our security assistance to make specific advancements in human rights in the countries in which we're partnering with?
Sorry. Senator, I think the way I would approach that is by saying, and again, I can't stress this enough from my vantage point, having done this particular job for now almost a year and a half. The reason that I feel so strongly about the role of the State Department, I think my colleagues would agree, although I don't want to speak for them, is for precisely the reason that you just outlined. Because, as I indicated in my opening remarks, we need to bring a holistic view of all of our foreign policy objectives into a discussion of any potential arms sale that we are about to make. The way we do that is, generally speaking anyway, through the State Department. That is our writ, that is our mandate. I believe strongly, and I think my colleagues at Defense would say the same, that even they know very clearly that we must integrate human rights and those concerns into our consideration of these sales, simply because it's not just the impact they will have in the recipient country, it's a function of, again, do we want to see the same threats emerge, for example, with regard to countering violent extremism or with countering terrorism. You don't want to see the same problems emerge over and over again as a function of the very assistance that we are providing.
Well, we're dealing with a lot of countries. Can you give me some specific examples of where we have specific strategies to advance human rights?
I think in almost any country that we're talking about, you raised several in your opening remarks. With all of those countries, we are very alert to how the specifics of the arms sales that we contemplate.
So what are we doing in Nigeria concerning the Nigerian forces in their way that they conduct their campaign for civilian losses?
Well, without commenting on the specific sale itself, because we haven't yet gone through the process of notification, I would say we are contemplating the full range of effects that we might have, again, if we pursue that sale. I believe strongly that we've had a very robust conversation with the Nigerian government on the importance of human rights, observing human rights, and specifically in the area of concern in northeastern Nigeria. I think you've heard from the highest level of the State Department, and I can only reiterate it here, our commitment to keep doing that, to continue to have that dialogue. And it will be, as I said, featured very strongly in any consideration.
I think the sale has been notified. I noticed, I could be wrong, but I think it has. What I'm finding, what works is when you have specific specific standards you expect them to comply with. Doesn't have to be announced, doesn't have to be broadcast, but you have to have ways of judging progress. I haven't seen that. So I'm going to ask if you would reply in writing to me.
Absolutely.
As to the strategies in the countries that we're dealing with, what are our objectives and the discussions that are taking place. If it has to be done in a classified setting, I'm more than happy to do it in a classified setting. But I am concerned that I don't see that commitment as definitively as I want. I understand the overall issues, but as definitively as I think we need to make it, certainly in Nigeria as a country of major concern and interest.
Senator, could I add that from a Defense Department standpoint, as part of our NDA reforms, we did have for the first time provisions in our law for training and equip programs that we have to incorporate human rights training for any of the forces that we actually train on the ground, which is a significant shift for us, not just lip service, but there has to be real training so they understand the importance of abiding by human rights standards.
I appreciate that, and there are many specific examples I hope that we'll be able to share. I want to get to one. You all mentioned Section 333 and compliance with that directive from Congress. That's a minimum standard. I would hope that there is a closer relationship than just complying with the congressional mandate. Tell us what type of cooperation are we seeing in State Department with the Department of Defense on issues such as Ukraine security assistance or the special operations counterterrorism or irregular warfare activities. Do we have that same type of close consultation and input from the State Department?
Do you want to take that first?
Senator, yes, we do. I mean, at multiple levels, from the working level up to the principals in the White House, we do have the regular and active exchanges to ensure that we have a common understanding of what the challenge is and help develop common solutions for how we approach those. So I would say that level of interaction has been sort of instituted, if you will, beyond just what has been mandated from Congress.
I can only echo that. I think we have exceptionally close cooperation, especially on the issues that you mentioned, and there's no daylight really between the two departments on those things.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Isaacson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For Senator Cardin's reference, in Africa, we have used, through Millennium Challenge, we have used conditions on human rights and labor law as conditions on qualifying for participation in MCC very effectively. So your question is on this is important because it should be the same thing for security and defense as well. And when you make those conditions, that makes the host country a part of the decision. Ms. Cade, now, Section 333 of NDAA, I should know this. You referred to it. I did not. So did General Hooper a minute ago. Was that a byproduct or brought about because of what happened at Benghazi?
No, sir. I mean, I think that the genesis of it, and again, I can't speak to what those that put it together actually were aiming to accomplish, although I have to say that we very much stand behind it. We think it's a great effort. The idea, I think, was to try and do what we all know has to be done now, and that is the State Department has a wide swath of funds and authorities available to it to accomplish certain things in the security arena. Defense Department increasingly now also. In fact, we have roughly the same amount of money under management, depending on how you look at it. That's an enormous, sort of charge to us, if you will, to ensure that we are doing whole of government work. We can't be doing State Department efforts and DOD efforts. It doesn't work that way. Our partners don't look at it that way, nor should they. We should be aiming to have an approach that not just 333, I mean, our hope, again, as I said, is to broaden this, and in fact, in practice, we do it for other authorities. But the idea is to bring forward a process that identifies our priorities right at the outset, which we are doing right now in the steering committee that we discussed, for a whole range of priority countries, decide what makes sense for us, whether with regard to state authorities and funds or with DOD authorities and funds, and how do we ensure that those are complementary, so that we're not working to cross purposes, we're not duplicating effort, we're not doing anything, and that we are providing what we need to, both for our partners, but also for, I mean, primarily for U.S. national security interests. That's the idea.
In your testimony, you said states should not only see that the DOD concurs, but as part of the formulation of the game plan. Is that correct?
Yes. I mean, I believe that, first of all, we regard state concurrence as really an essential element because it gives us that visibility and that ability to say, at the end of the day, that critical foreign policy aspects like human rights are being adequately addressed. But I think even more than that, what we want is to ensure, as we are doing with 333, that we're starting all the way back at the beginning. Because if, at the end of the day, a program comes to us that DOD has already formulated, and they've gone through a long process, and it's very arduous, and it's not easy to do, and the combatant commanders have had their say, and if they come to us at the end of all of that, and we don't have a full understanding of how they got there in the first place, there may be unintended consequences. There could be things that happen that, again, from a budgetary standpoint, where there will be implications down the road for the State Department. To us, it seems as though the more productive way to be doing this, again, is to be looking at the outset at how do we bring all this together. So 333 is, if you will, sort of the most robust effort we have undertaken at something that's this important. And I would argue it's that important. But of course, again, my colleague at DOD can speak to it as well.
Senator, I would agree with everything Ambassador Cade now said. It only makes sense to have both State Department and DOD involved at the front end of development of any project, because it's too late if we wait to throw it over the transom, because we may be far afield from what the foreign policy direction would be from State Department. So their involvement at the ground level is absolutely essential. Just to answer your question on the origin of 333, essentially before 333 we had multiple number of authorities related to individual strands of activity and train and equip: counter WMD, counterterrorism, counter narcotics, border control. What we recognize in the real world is those problems don't come in sort of stovepipe fashion. They overlap in many ways. And so what we did was, with the help of our oversight committees, is create an authority that can address all those in combination as a collective whole as they appear in the real world.
The reason I brought up the Benghazi situation, and that's a sad chapter for all of us, and I'm not trying to revisit a sad chapter, but I want to make sure we don't have a second chapter sometime in the future. And when you talk about coordination and planning, do you feel like at DOD and at the Department of State that we are better positioned today for the security of our embassies across the world and have plans ready so that we can get backup help to our ambassadors should they need it?
Obviously, I'm not the responsible individual at the State Department, but I will tell you, I mean, I feel more confident, and certainly I believe that, our department's highest leadership would tell you that this is a huge priority for them. The Secretary starts every meeting that he convenes with, upper-level management in the State Department by talking about security issues.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. Your written testimony and the questions of my colleagues have been helpful on this issue of trying to figure out how to streamline, consolidate, make what we do in security assistance more effective. I want to ask a real practical question about a concern I have right now. The results are not yet in on the referendum that was held in Kurdistan yesterday in northern Iraq about the non-binding referendum around independence, but the likely results are going to be a very strong support expressed in that referendum. The security assistance we currently provide to the Kurds is sizable, and it is routed through the Baghdad government. I think it's probably maybe about $2.2 billion in the last two appropriations, which are combined to Iraq for security assistance that can be used by the central government, the tribal leaders, or Kurdistan. How might, as we're contemplating how to do security assistance, we have to deal with our own internal challenges, but also a situation like the Kurds who have been good partners. That's going to create a potential challenge. How are state and defense contemplating this if Baghdad reacts negatively to the referendum result and tries to block or slow down assistance passing through Baghdad to Erbil? The Kurds have been, huge partners of ours in the anti-ISIS battle. Can you talk a little bit about DOD and State Department perspectives on that referendum and how that might affect security assistance in the region? And that's the only question I'm going to have. So I'll just let you all tackle that one.
Thank you, Senator. It's funny because I ran into my colleague Brett McGurk in the parking garage just as I was coming over here, who is by far better positioned to answer some of the specific questions that you just asked. Look, I think we've made clear that we find it unfortunate that the Kurdish authorities have chosen at this moment to undertake this particular referendum. We regard the authorities in Baghdad as being, and we regard the integrity of Iraq as being quite important. I will defer probably the questions on, what the implication of some of the security assistance issues may be until we see what the outcome of all this is. Mm-hmm. Clearly, we are having a conversation. We are always having that conversation from the policy vantage point, not just on that specific issue, but I will say more broadly on Iraq issues writ large. Just this past week, I was dealing with another issue on tanks and so forth, which I won't get into in this setting, but we're happy to brief you on those things too. Look, these are big issues. The government of Iraq, we feel, it's incredibly important to support them in any way we can. That said, there are going to be, issues related to what they can afford, what the sustainability of some of that assistance down the road is going to be, how they apportion it, what the implications of the referendum and some of the associated other political issues may be. There's lots of questions associated with all of this. So rather than get into the minutiae of all that, I think we'd be happy to give you a more full briefing if you ask for it. We'd be more than pleased.
Thank you. How about from the DOD?
I think, Senator, echo everything that Ambassador Cade now said. I'd say our near-term focus is and has to remain on the counter-ISIS challenge. And so minimizing the complications or distractions from that central focus, I think, is our priority right now from a DOD standpoint. And we can get you greater detail on sort of the implications of the vote in Kurdistan after this session, sir.
Do you believe the pendency of the referendum, could you see any degree to which the pendency of the referendum tangibly harmed the anti-ISIS fight?
Theoretically, but I think we are working collectively as a U.S. government to ensure that all the primary actors on the ground sort of stay focused on that primary challenge. So we will do everything we can to prevent that, and I think I have confidence we'll be able to do that.
General Hooper, do you have anything to add on this issue?
No, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. See the rest of my time.
Thank you, Senator Kane. Senator Young.
Thank you. Ambassador Cadenaugh, I want to ask you a number of questions about the legal authorities that inform your office's work, your work, and circumscribed as well. So to begin here, according to Department of State's website, in addition to undertaking a legal review of each of the proposed arms transfer deals that comes before your office and third-party transfers, the Political Military Affairs Bureau also applies the conventional arms transfer policy laid out in Presidential Policy Directive 27. Is that correct?
Yes.
So that policy has presumably been applied to arms transfers to Saudi Arabia, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. That policy requires the administration to take into account a number of criteria, correct?
Absolutely.
So I have those criteria in front of me right here. One of the criterion is that state, among other things, must take into account the, quote, human rights record of the recipient. Agreed?
Absolutely.
Okay. Another criterion of this policy is you say, in effect, that a state must consider, quote, the likelihood that the recipient would use the arms to commit human rights abuses or serious violations of international humanitarian law, or identify the United States with human rights abuses or serious violations of international humanitarian law. Agreed?
Yep.
I'll also note that Section 502B, which you're likely familiar with, of the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, limits security assistance to a country which engages in a consistent pattern of gross violations of internationally recognized human rights unless the President certifies in writing to the Speaker of the House, to the Chairman of this committee, and others that extraordinary circumstances exist. Ambassador, has such a certification been submitted to this Congress to transfer arms to Saudi Arabia?
Well, again, it depends on, I guess, what we're talking about and at what time frame and so forth. In the past, of course, we have made arms transfers to Saudi Arabia.
I'm talking about the arms transfers that have occurred in recent months during this Congress from the United States of America to Saudi Arabia.
In the past, yes, we have made some of those transfers. So,
including this most recent arms transfer. It's a yes or no question.
yes, sir.
All right, thank you. So, as Acting Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of Political Military Affairs, responsible for implementing this policy, State has gone ahead, as you said, and consistent with the conventional arms transfer policy, as well as Section 502B, which I've invoked, what is State's assessment regarding Saudi Arabia's actions in Yemen? That is, has Saudi Arabia used U.S. weapons in Yemen to commit human rights abuses or serious violations of international humanitarian law? Yes or no?
Senator, we've had a chance in the past to come before the committee and the members and the staff to talk about some of this, not all of which I can discuss in this setting. But you asked the question, and I will tell you, we have expressed concerns to the Saudi government, and we've had the conversation with them on many of these issues. And indeed, we are trying to address them as we contemplate any sales to Saudi Arabia.
So you're in charge of the office that's supposed to take into account, under our laws, these criteria. I know it's a multi-factor test, as the lawyers say. You balance the various factors against
Correct.
one another. So it's not a binary test. So it is possible that there were human rights violations of internationally respected human rights law, and you're not foreclosing that possibility here today. Is that correct?
I think what I'm saying is that we have had that conversation with the Saudis, and we've had the conversation.
Are you foreclosing it?
Are we foreclosing?
Are you foreclosing the possibility that human rights violations have occurred?
No, in fact, I think the Saudis themselves have indicated that in the past that they have done some things that they find problematic and that they are trying to address some of those issues.
Okay. Ambassador, thank you for indulging all these questions. On June 28, at my direction, my staff asked the Department of State for an advisory legal opinion with respect to Saudi Arabia's refusal to permit the delivery of cranes to Hodeidah, the major port in Yemen. We think that may very well constitute a violation of customary international humanitarian law, Rule 55. That's the international legal provision that prohibits denying life-saving food or medicine into an area in furtherance of war aims. And so on September 18, almost 3 months later, My office was notified that State wasn't able to provide me with that advisory legal opinion. Can you explain why State hasn't provided me that legal opinion, or anyone on this committee, to my knowledge?
I'm sorry, Senator, I don't have the exact precise rationale for why that was not provided to you in a timely way. I will have to go back and ask and bring that answer to you.
Okay, thank you for your indulgence. I'll just note that I'll be submitting a question for the record related to the excess defense articles provisions and the transfer of Humvees. Lieutenant General Hooper, I'd be grateful for your timely response on that matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Young. Senator Murphy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. Let me follow up on the questions from Senator Young, because I share all of his concerns. Yemen currently is arguably the worst humanitarian catastrophe in the world today, an epidemic of both famine and cholera that the country has never seen before. And let me maybe take the conversation out of the weeds a little bit and ask a simple question to either you, Ms. Cadno, or you, Mr. Harvey. What clear, explainable, definable concessions have we extracted from the Saudis with respect to the conduct of this war inside Yemen since the announcement, or in coordination with the announcement, of the biggest arms sale to Saudi Arabia, celebrated by the very high-profile visit of President Trump to Riyadh earlier this year? Nothing has seemed to have changed there. The humanitarian catastrophe gets worse every single month. It does not get better. Senator Young and I have asked this very simple thing of the Saudis, to let these cranes that the U.S. taxpayers paid for be delivered to Hodeidah in order to more efficiently move humanitarian relief into the country. None of that has been addressed. So what specific concessions have we gotten from the Saudis with respect to the conduct of the war in Yemen as a result of the massive military aid? And what role has State or Department of Defense played in that?
Well, first of all, let me just again emphasize that I think we are deeply committed to ensuring that the Saudis understand the importance, and the Saudis themselves have said they understand the importance of complying with the law in armed conflict. It's essential, and
Who cares what they say?
Understood. I think our judgment has been that engaging with them and providing them the means to actually effectuate some of that is the best way to go.
So specific examples.
You may recall that one of the largest pieces and one of the first things that we moved towards notification after the announcement of the arms deal that you mentioned was a $750 million training case to the Saudi armed forces. And that training case involved a large component that was training specifically on the law of armed conflict. So it wasn't as though all we gave them was the means to pursue the conflict itself. We are trying to give them an understanding of how do you do that, because it's not so much about the weapons per se as it is the way you implement and utilize the weapons. My colleagues at Defense can probably speak more to that than I can. And in fact, we've had a group of trainers that have now gone on the ground in the first, for the first part of this, this training case that we notified, to try and get that process underway. So we're very alive to it. The Saudis are alive to it. I recognize that, the proof is in the pudding, that they're going to have to show that those actions comport with what they say. That is what we are committed to doing with them.
Let me, listen, I share Senator Young's concerns here. I think that our policy in Yemen has been an epic failure, and I understand the Saudis spend a lot of money coming up here and making promises about how they are going to change the conduct of this war. They have not. And they have refused to do very simple things that could alleviate the horror that exists in Yemen today. And we as a country, these are my words, not anyone else's, are complicit in many of the worst things that are happening there. Let me ask you a broader question. So right now, as you mentioned, the capacity is split between DoD and State, moving from a time at the beginning of the 2000s when about 80% of this aid came through the Department of State. Just explain to us why this capacity still needs to be split. Every military conflict that we are involved in overseas has a political root at the bottom of it. This isn't the 1800s when armies march against each other and there's a peace treaty. There's a political problem at the bottom of all of these military conflicts. So now that we are sort of in the process of winding down the two biggest conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, why wouldn't we just return this capacity to the State Department? Why wouldn't we go back to 80% of this capacity in the State Department? Why split it half and half with defense and state?
Well, again, I think my colleague addressed some of this in his opening remarks. I mean, I think the judgment has been, and it's really, I can't speak to what Congress's intention was, but I think the idea was, because there are specific train and equip type issues, operational issues, and the flexibility and the speed with which a lot of this is necessary to deploy made it extant. And because the nature of some of these threats seem to be, I think, both emergent and urgent, and also dealt with, at least in part, through military means. Our argument has been, along the lines of what you just said, that it all has a political component. And therefore, as we progress down this road, even if that money is allocated or those authorities are allocated to DOD, the State Department should retain an essential role, at least of concurrence, and again, arguably from our vantage point, and as Todd has indicated, you know, the earlier the better in that process, frankly, from a joint formulation standpoint, a joint development standpoint. It makes sense for all the reasons that you articulated, and particularly in understanding your concerns on Saudi Arabia on any issue. It makes sense for the State Department to be at the outset of that process. You can bring those concerns to the State Department. We will be responsive. It is a holistic effort. It should be a holistic effort. There are some things DOD does better than we do. And there are some things that we do better, I would argue, and there are different purposes oftentimes for those fundings. FMF is designed to accomplish addressing long-term capability gaps on the part of our military partners overseas. Some of the authorities that DoD has are far more targeted. They need to be moved out the door quicker. They're not set up necessarily for long-term development of capability building. We need to, though, think about all of that as we plan forward. You can't just do the one or the other. You need to understand that entire array of authorities and then try and bring them together, and particularly if we're going to face increasing resource challenges, which I think we probably will. So that I think is the rationale for doing it in a way that is respectful of DoD's abilities, respectful of our particular expertise, but also brings it together in a way that makes sense for all of us. And for you, I hope.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Rubio.
Thank you. I want to focus a little bit on the international narcotics and law enforcement funding. In particular, we've seen this extraordinary rise in the production of cocaine in Colombia, and we know that's going to be transited here, primarily through land bridge, through Central America, but potentially through air routes as well through the Caribbean region. And at the heart of the challenges facing El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras in particular is the role that these transnational groups play on the ground, and each has struggled in its own way to confront it. I'm most familiar of the three with the Honduran efforts. And obviously I also look at the Colombian model of assistance over the years as something people have pointed to as a model of success. And in fact, in many ways, the Colombians have become force multipliers for us. They're now on the ground in those countries in Central America providing assistance, although there's some concern about some recent decisions they've made with their own program vis-a-vis the peace process there that some attribute to the rise in cocaine production. So my first question is just an analysis of where we are in terms of how that overlays with our policies in the region, because ultimately one of the, I think, most compelling arguments is that the U.S. southern border doesn't really begin on the Mexican border. It starts much sooner than that in places like Guatemala and the like. So three quick opportunities here to discuss. Number one, how would you assess the progress of those programs and where they stand today? Obviously, each country has different challenges in the Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. Number two, do we believe that the capacity, even the increased capacity of these nations, is quickly going to be overwhelmed by the massive amount of cocaine that needs to be moved over the next number of years? And number three, the potential to partner with the Mexican government, who has their own concerns about instability just south of them, and how those three things play out is in the interplay between the assistance we provide and our foreign policy aims for the region. I know that's a three-part question, but they're all interrelated. So.
Well, I'll take a quick stab at giving you an answer, although, I would have to just defer to some of my colleagues who deal both with international narcotics and law enforcement and also with the Western Hemisphere affairs. But I do think we're making progress. I recognize the challenges that you've outlined. And I would also say, again, as we look at the entire array of countries that we are assisting, we are looking at all the foreign policy elements, and that involves human rights issues, other kinds of issues, governance issues, and so forth. But I do think with regard to the international narcotics effort, we're making some progress. This is another area where I would argue, again, we have authorities and funding. DOD has authority and funding. It only makes sense for us to be, again, bringing those efforts together. Section 333 actually addressed some of those authorities, not all of them, but some of them. And that's another, I think, set of issues that we are now sitting down at a table trying to look at in terms of what we can do and what DOD can do, identify, again, some priority elements within our strategy to try and make sure that the proper resources are addressed in those directions. By the way, you mentioned Colombia, just to say, I mean, one of the things that I think is underappreciated sometimes is that we not only do security assistance writ large, what we do is stabilization. And in support of the peace process, for example, in Colombia, the State Department is very active in terms of demining, removal of unexploded ordnance in some of the areas where the peace process has indicated they need that help. We did a fair amount together with the Norwegian government to put in place a donor effort that will lend itself to that. So we're actually looking not just at the security assistance per se in terms of aiding the relevant forces on the ground. It's also in support of a larger effort at stabilization that will then create an environment, we hope, in which these things will not reproduce themselves.
I guess the only follow-up I would have on that is one of the issues we run into as we discuss these programs on an annual basis is in many of these nations still, the military becomes the default law enforcement organism as opposed to traditional law enforcement from a variety of different reasons. And how would you assess where we stand in terms of capacity building for their own justice system, in essence, the training and equipping of police officers and other law enforcement officials, their court system, their systems of justice? How does that generally play out in the broader, everything from prisons to prosecutors to,
yes,
to defense attorneys for that matter? How do those things interplay, and what do we do to assist in that regard?
I can't agree with you more. I think my INL colleague, Bill Brownfield, Ambassador Brownfield, would argue the same thing. I mean, this has to be a longer-term approach, and it cannot simply be military-focused. We must do what we can to build rule of law throughout, throughout the countries of concern. I think we're making some progress, I will tell you, but it's not uniform, and I think we're going to have to work harder with them together in partnership. So it's a long-term problem, and we're not there yet, that's for sure. But we recognize the importance of everything you just said.
Senator, and part of that equation is also working with our defense ministry counterparts in these countries to understand the proper role of the military in a government and society led by civilians, and so helping them understand sort of their proper subordination, if you will, to civilian leadership is part of that equation that we have. DOD has programs that are dedicated to.
Senator Booker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Cadena, could I just start really quick on the sort of surprise to me of the announcement that Chad has been included in the administration's travel ban. And you mentioned Chad in your testimony. The White House itself stated that Chad is, and I quote, an important, valuable counterterrorism partner to the United States. And the State Department itself in its report stated that the Chad government continues to prioritize counterterrorism efforts at the highest level. You know Chad's role in AFRICOM. They're incredibly involved in counterterrorism efforts in the region. You talk about Flintlock in your testimony. It supports French, U.S. military deployments in the region. It's been critical in efforts against Boko Haram. Chadian troops played a major role in countering al-Qaeda's operations in Mali. They deploy over 1,000, I think about 1,400 troops. And so I guess the specific questions I have is, this designation just seems arbitrary to me. And if we have concerns about weak border security and screening capacity, clearly other countries facing similar challenges, Mali, Central African Republic, Nigeria, why aren't they on the travel ban? And then Sudan, clearly, we have some significant issues. So I'm hoping you can shed some light on this for me. And I'm really curious if the State Department and the DOD have input into this decision. And finally, and again, this is just press reports from this morning about the whiplash that the Chad leaders, like the president, are having, who are so influential and such critical partners. Does this really, in some ways, undermine our multilateral efforts that have been so productive against Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram?
I'd be happy to take the question. I will be honest with you and tell you that I can't give you a full, rationale sitting here this morning, at least not in this setting, but we'd be happy to give you, I think, more of the thinking on that. I will say, though, that as you indicated in your remarks, we do think of Chad as an important partner for us on CT efforts in a variety of ways. It is certainly my hope that none of that will change. We are looking to, I think, be cooperative with Chad and whatever requirements they can provide for us in order to, ameliorate or to address some of these issues. I'm quite confident they will work together with us in order to try and do. But again, I will take the question and I will happily bring you back an answer.
So to the chairman and ranking member, I have a lot of frustration when I hear responses that we'll get back to you. Senator Paul and I wrote a letter to Secretary Tillerson in June expressing our deep disappointment about the administration's decision to proceed with the sale of arms, specifically the A-29 attack aircraft to the Nigerian government. We requested a briefing as well about the sale and to help understand how this determination was made. We cited in that letter a lot of detail, lack of progress from authorities in Abuja about the government's investigation into the December 2015 alleged massacre by soldiers of over 300 Shiite Muslims. You mentioned this, Senator Cardin, in your remarks. I mean, it's disturbing what we're seeing. We cited the incomplete investigation into the January 2017 attack on an IDP camp in Iran by the Nigerian Air Force, killed over, again, 200 refugees, as well as a lack of progress on a fair investigation into the 2014 killings by the Nigerian security forces of over 600, mostly unarmed detainees, including children. We wrote, Senator Paul and I wrote, that there continues to be additional allegations of corruption, abuse, misconduct throughout the Nigerian military. We asked in our letter that the State Department reconsider the decision to sell attack A-29s to Nigeria until some kind of reforms are put in place. And so I've sort of heard this before, whether it is the questions that were asked by my bipartisan questions asked by my colleagues about what's going on in Yemen. I've not been assured that any of the reforms or safeguards are being put into place before these sales are made. And so I understand that there are new reports now of military equipment granted by the United States from MRAP vehicles provided for use against Boko Haram that are being used in the southeast, and apparently to intimidate people agitating for independence. And so I really appreciate the seeming willingness to be cooperative, but we have a role to play. And I have growing frustrations. I know I'm new on this committee. I'm damn near sitting in the audience here so far in the end. But this is absolutely unacceptable for our role in accordance with the Constitution. And so I don't understand that I can't even get a briefing on this issue, whether it's in this context or another. I'm just looking for someone to give me actually information. Because according to the Constitution, the administration can't continue to engage in these kind of activities without our authorization. And as Senator Murphy said, we're complicit in some of the most horrific things that are going on the planet Earth right now by regimes who are not acting in any way in accordance with our values as a country or our interest for our national security. And you even alluded to the fact that we could be creating, when it comes to terrorism, the very problem we claim to be trying to end. And so this is absolutely unacceptable to me, that we allow representative after representative to come before this committee and make promises that we're going to get information, or we're going to have hearings, and we get nothing in return. And I'm frankly fed up, and the consequences of the lack of information right now is horrific. What's going on in Sudan, what's going on in Yemen, what's going on in Nigeria. It is horrific what's going on to people who are craving freedom and looking to the United States. And so I just want to register my absolute frustration. And the responses here, no disrespect, are unacceptable when we get talk and not even a meeting, not even a briefing that's any substance and answers the questions from the United States senators on both sides of the aisle. Thank you,
Mr. Chairman, if I might, I just want to share Senator Booker's frustration. As ranking member, I've had to exercise my authority to call the Secretary of State to get some of this information, when I should be getting it from the people who are directly involved in making these policies. I've had less than satisfactory assurances in regards to commitments that I thought were previously made in regards to arms sales of countries. So I would just urge our panelists who have the direct responsibility, if you believe that the legislative branch of government is part of this process, you need to do a much more effective job in communications, but more importantly, on living up to the broad statements that you are making with specific progress and goals that we are achieving to prevent these types of complicities in human rights violations of other countries.
Thank you, Senator Cardin. I think, again, just brings us back to the point of effectively managing a multi-billion-dollar effort, making sure it's organized, managed properly. So thank you. Senator Merkley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ambassador, as Secretary Tillerson reorganized the State Department, can you confirm for the committee that there are no plans to move security assistance oversight function of the Bureau of Political Military Affairs to the Department of Defense?
Senator, not that I'm aware of, but that's not to say, I mean, I don't have the full array of understandings that you're looking for, I think, with regard to what the final output of that redesign process will be. I believe the Deputy Secretary actually will be coming up to the Hill on the House side, I believe, in the next day or so to be talking about some of that. So, but I mean, the State Department regards that role as an essential one, as we've described today, and I believe, as far as I can tell anyway, that the upper levels of the State Department, including the Secretary, the Deputy Secretary, still feel that way.
Okay. Thank you. The administration has indicated it plans to provide lethal military assistance to the government of Ukraine, and there's a variety of views as to whether that assistance either enables the government of Ukraine to more effectively oppose the forces occupying eastern portion of the nation, or whether it triggers a Russian response at a higher level, leading to greater bloodshed and greater support for the forces that oppose the government of Ukraine. What's your view of this?
Well, again, it's an active discussion, as you indicated. I think the policy has yet to be fully decided. It is something that our two departments are engaged in discussing right this minute, together with the White House. And before the White House and the President make their decisions on this, I'd hesitate to take a position. But I think, again, there are considerations that you have outlined, and there are others as well that we have to look at in the entirety of these decisions. They're important decisions. And by the way, just to reference what Senator Booker and the ranking member said, at any moment, if you wish for a briefing on any particular issue, I am happy to provide it. I think the State Department is committed to that, as are my colleagues at DOD. And on Ukraine, I could offer the same. But I think in this setting, it's a little hard to get into all of the back and forth. I would say, again, that the Ukrainians, we believe strongly that the Ukrainians are important partners, friends of ours, and we want to be sure that their defense is adequately taken care of.
I'll just say my experience has been extremely frustrating with the Department of State, and when you say they are committed, those are at this point empty words. One of the things that occurred recently, this committee considered a bill related to the West Bank, and we were promised a briefing from the Department of State over basically the types of projects that were being undertaken both through nonprofits and through the Palestinian Authority. And the briefing was a complete fiasco. No information provided, despite the fact the committee was in the middle of wrestling with how to sustain productive activities on the West Bank while sending a very strong message to the PA about their horrific policy of rewarding the families of those who commit acts of terrorism. I mean, that's just an example, and my committee members, I think, could each cite some other examples. So it's important to follow up what the philosophy you just expressed with actual action. Turning back to the Ukraine and Mr. Harvey, the president of Ukraine has called for UN peacekeepers to be in eastern Ukraine. Is the United States supportive of that request?
Senator, I'll have to take that question. I'm not in a position to answer on that right now.
Is there any sense for any of the three of you that that request changes the dynamic in terms of whether we provide military assistance to the Ukraine government?
I think, Senator, we're looking at the entire array of issues as with regard to Ukraine. What we're hoping to see is fulfillment of the Minsk requirements. We are looking to be supportive of that process. As you know, we now have a special envoy appointed by the State Department, Kurt Volker, who is out there doing his level best, I think, to try and engage with his Russian counterparts and with others on these very topics. It's an issue of real concern and great interest to our secretary. And so with regard to the policy overall, I can assure you of that. And as we contemplate whatever we will do with regard to security assistance, it will fit into that larger picture.
What are the forms of lethal military assistance that would best serve our goals of supporting the Ukrainian government while not provoking, if you will, Russian escalation?
I think that's the open question. I mean, that's what we're trying to grapple
That is a question.
with.
That's why I'm asking
Yes.
it.
No, I understand. We're looking at the various options, and I think what we're trying to decide again is what will serve the political purposes most adequately. I don't have an answer for you now because there is no actual decision.
Lieutenant General Cooper, would you like to comment on that?
Senator, it's fundamentally a policy question. I would defer to my colleagues to respond to that.
Well, it's a policy question in which military insights are certainly very relevant. I'm sure the military side is very engaged in that. And so what are your insights?
Well, I would, as we do with each and every case where we assess what our partners might need and what might be appropriate, we would follow the process we always do and which we've articulated from the very beginning, which is to collaborate in a transparent fashion in order to determine what is best appropriate and what will best address both our security objectives and the overall policy objectives.
Mr. Harvey, when are we going to get a detailed proposal of what best fulfills the administration's plans to provide lethal military support to the government of Ukraine?
I think, as Ambassador Cade now had indicated, Senator, that is an issue that's being debated at senior levels of the administration.
So I'm glad it's being debated. When are we on the committee going to get insights from you all, since we're not hearing any today?
As soon as, I think, as we're close to making a decision, I think would be the appropriate time to come over and give you an update on what our
Any sense of the timing on that?
I'm sorry?
Any sense of the timing on that?
I don't have that for you right now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Merkley, and I'll make my question quick here. Just a question on the Philippines. Could you describe to me, the appropriate witness, describe to me the assistance the United States is currently providing to the Philippines?
We are providing an array. Actually, I should probably defer to my DOD colleagues on this because they can give you a broader swath of kind of what we are doing. But just in a general sense, again, we believe strongly, and I think Secretary Mattis, not to speak for my colleagues, and Secretary Tillerson believe that we should be supporting the Philippine government with regard to the insurgency that they are now facing in a very, very sensitive and important place in the Philippines. And I think at the end of the day, we are doing what we can to, again, to give them not just military support, and I want to make sure that everybody understands this, we're also looking at ways to do stabilization so that once they are able to, we hope, defeat the insurgents, they will have the means to also give the population there some prospect of, of greater prosperity and greater peace and prosperity, I should say, which will allow then, again, the situation to calm down over the long term.
And
so we're looking at a whole variety of things.
Have we sent additional assistance to the Philippines recently in terms of military assistance?
Do you want to address the?
We are currently sending assistance to the Philippines, and the objective of that, in support of our policies, is to not only increase the lethality and capabilities of the Philippine military, but also their ability to stabilize the situation, and also assisting them in institution building so that their troops can not only stabilize the situation, but ensure that the violence ceases. And that civil authority and civil stability is allowed to flourish.
And have they made additional requests for assistance regarding ISIS or related groups in Mindanao?
We are in discussions with the Filipino government in that regard. I mean, we see that obviously the challenge in Marawi is not limited to that particular location, so we have concerns about it spreading beyond that particular engagement right now, and so we are discussing how we might best address it through additional assistance.
Are those discussions coming from requests from the Philippines, or did we proactively seek those?
I think it's, you could say it's probably initiating from both sides of the recognition that it would be useful for us to cooperate in that regard.
Thank you. And I'm going to borrow the script here from.
Sure. Can I just ask one quick
Yeah, please, Senator Cardin.
One point for the. I understand the policy on congressional review and disapproval in the law. Do you all believe that is helpful in furthering the goals for the congressional review and disapproval process?
Absolutely. We are incredibly, as I said in the opening remarks, appreciative of the congressional role, and I think it is an essential oversight function that we have, you've clearly made your views known today, and we respect that, and we look to it as a guideline for how we do some of our work.
Mr. Harvey?
Would incur completely with what Ambassador Cade now said. It's an essential part of our policymaking to have
General?
inputs.
It is absolutely an essential part of our policy process.
I was hoping to hear that from you, and because our questions here are well intended, and we feel very passionately about the values of this country and using every opportunity we have to advance those values, and that's why you hear the passion from the members of this committee. And that's why it's important that the close relationship between State Department and Defense be maintained. And that's, I think, the reason behind the National Defense Authorization Act amendment. So explain to me why, or do you would think of taking away from Congress the ability to deal with small arms, including the type of weapons that are used by snipers, particularly when there have been two highly visible small arms sales, one that was withdrawn from by the administration as it relates to Turkey, the other which involves the Philippines and their extrajudicial killings of their civilian population and their drug policy. Why would you think that would be helpful to take away congressional review, or maybe you don't think it's helpful?
Senator, you're referencing, I think, the question of whether we transfer responsibility from state to commerce for a specific category or several categories of weapons. And this is part of a larger effort that we have undertaken over the last 5-6 years.
But doesn't these arms affect the policy considerations we're talking about here, particularly the message we're sending?
So I'd say a couple of things. First of all, this is still, these rules have yet to be fully published, and they will be, I hope, at some point, and then there will be plenty of time for further commentary. But I will say, our belief strongly is that military-grade weapons will continue to be a function of State Department oversight. What will be at least contemplated for transfer over to commerce would be the kinds of weapons that are readily available at, again, any retail outlet here in the United States. And so the notion that the State Department should be regulating their export overseas strikes us as not hewing to the specific purpose that the State Department is supposed to accomplish with its authority.
So if that's true, why did we labor over the Turkish sale and cancel it if it?
So I would say a couple of things. First of all, again, just the assumption that that items will transfer over to the Commerce Department does not mean that there will be no process for actually evaluating those sales.
But that evaluation will not include Congress.
Well, no, what I would say is that Commerce regularly comes to the State Department to ask our opinion on sales of that nature.
But they don't come to Congress.
You come to us, though, and we will have some.
But if Commerce is making the decision, this committee loses all oversight. That is, human rights and other considerations are gone if you don't have congressional review. Commerce doesn't review that. Yes, they may consult with you, but you're taking us out of the equation, and all three of you said congressional review is important.
Well, again, we believe strongly that the most important, most sensitive weapons, the ones that you would concern yourself with on a regular basis, that, again, military-grade weapons, that's the kind of thing where the State Department should continue to exercise its controls. Other kinds of weapons, it just seems as though, again, what we're doing is we're dispersing the State Department's effort over a number of different licensing arrangements where, in theory, we could be focusing on the kinds of things that we all know need to be, as a sensitive set of technologies, need to be more appropriately regulated.
And I would just remind you that the people of this country probably have focused more on what happened in Washington, D.C. against peaceful protesters and the extrajudicial killings in the Philippines. They're probably more knowledgeable about that than many of the other issues we've been talking about today. And they looked to their elected officials to represent their views. If we're going to have a cooperative relationship, it appears to me this is a direct affront to congressional input that you all thought was important.
Again, Senator, I mean, we're happy to talk to you more, I think, about the categories of weapons that we're discussing and what the appropriate dividing line among those weapons are. But our strong feeling is that we want the State Department to do what we believe those regulations were intended to do, which is focus on highly sensitive technologies where either our commercial edge or our troops will be endangered overseas through the spread of those weapons.
And sniper weapons don't fall into that category?
Again, we can talk a little bit more in a different setting about the specifics of each of those weapons, but I believe, we've looked closely at the kinds of things we are proposing, and again, this is all still in that stage, but nevertheless, and we're happy to talk to you more about it.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because I have not, I could be wrong about that. I'm not aware, I'm reading press accounts, not consultation with Congress as to these decisions being made. I certainly have not been privy to any direct opportunity. I've expressed myself pretty clearly about this, but I haven't seen any attempt to get the input of members of Congress on this policy change. And considering that there are two very highly visible sales that are involved here, it does look like an end run around Congress.
We'd welcome the chance to give you a further briefing on this, you and your staff, at any moment that you want.
Thank you. On behalf of Chairman Corker, I want to thank all of our, and on behalf of myself, I want to thank all the witnesses today for their testimony here today. The record will remain open until the close of business on Monday, so that members can submit questions for the record. We would ask our witnesses to promptly respond to those questions for the record. And with that, the hearing stands adjourned.
Thank you, sir.
Hey, Marine Sergeant Alex Smith here. The Osprey made pretty big news last week, completing the first trans-Pacific flight from Hawaii to Australia and then back. Marine Medium Tilt Squadron VMM 268 left from Hawaii to start their 16th month deployment back in April. On September 19th, they made their 5,300-mile flight back. Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Robertson, the commanding officer of VMM 268, said, "Not only was it historic, but it showed this aircraft in Hawaii is operationally relevant to any crisis in the Pacific. We can go anywhere, and this flight shows the importance of having this aircraft active and here." In other news, another first in history. VMFA 121 conducted the first hot load with an air-to-air missile on an F-35B September 21st. The purpose of conducting the hot load was to verify theory and publication, and to give Marines involved a chance to load live ordnance while the aircraft is running. And that's your Marine Minute.
$196 military nominations to the
So
Senate.
moved.
Is there a second? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
The motion carries. The committee meets this morning to consider the nomination of General Joseph Dunford for reappointment as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. General Dunford, this committee thanks you for your decades of distinguished service to our nation. We are grateful to your wife, Ellen, for the support that she has always provided to you and to all who serve our nation in uniform. I'd also like to welcome your son, Patrick. Fortunately, you look like your mother, Patrick. Thank you. Who is joining us this morning. I know that your other children, Joe and Kathleen, send their support from afar, even as I bet they are a little relieved that they do not have to sit through your interrogation. In order to exercise its legislative and oversight responsibilities, it's important that this committee and other appropriate committees of the Congress are able to receive testimony, briefings, and other communications of information. Have you adhered to applicable laws and regulations governing conflicts of interest?
I have, Chairman.
Do you agree when asked to give your personal views, even if those views differ from the administration in power?
I do, Chairman.
Have you assumed any duties or undertaken any actions which would appear to presume the outcome of the confirmation process?
I have not, Chairman.
Will you ensure your staff complies with deadlines established for requested communications, including questions for the record in hearings?
I will, Chairman.
Will you cooperate in providing witnesses and briefers in response to congressional requests?
Yes, Chairman.
Will those witnesses be protected from reprisal for their testimony or briefings?
They will be, Chairman.
Do you agree if confirmed to appear and testify upon request before this committee?
I do, Chairman.
Do you agree to provide documents, including the copies of electronic forms of communication in a timely manner when requested by a duly constituted committee, or to consult with the committee regarding the basis for any good faith delay or denial in providing such documents?
I do, Chairman.
And my colleagues and I are aware that that is a routine, but given the political environment today, especially, and certainly not any reflection on you, General Dunford, but those questions need to be asked. And I thank you for your responses. General Dunford, my colleagues and I will have a lot of questions for you about the many pressing national security challenges we face, but this hearing also offers an opportunity to reflect on some broader topics that have historically and more recently been a major focus of this committee's efforts: the unique role of the chairman in our national security structure and the state of civil-military relations. As, quote, principal military advisor to the President, the National Security Council, the Secretary of Defense, and the Congress, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is the most important military duty in our nation. The chairman is the one military officer with the authority to present comprehensive analysis and advice to civilian policy makers, informed by all the military services and combatant commands, and spanning every global and functional issue of national security. This responsibility is now more important than ever. Our country faces a multitude of national security challenges, all of which cut across the regional and functional organizations that divide up the Department of Defense. The chairman is the only military officer with a truly comprehensive perspective on the joint force, on all the threats we face worldwide, and the interplay between them. That is why this committee acted last year to clarify the chairman's statutory responsibility to advise civilian leaders on the global strategic integration of our military efforts. The chairman's unique role lends extra gravity to the responsibility that you and every military officer possesses, the responsibility to provide best military advice to civilian leaders. This is not a luxury. It is a duty. It is a duty that military officers owe to the American people and to the men and women under their command. Civilian policymakers in both the executive and legislative branches rely on our military professionals to better understand the military dimensions of the national security challenges we face and the options at our disposal for wielding military power effectively. But best military advice does not stop there. Military officers, and especially the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, must tell their civilian superiors what action they believe are best and right to take, and they must do so honestly, candidly, respectfully, but forcefully, whether civilians want to hear it or not. Best military advice may be disregarded, but it must always be given. What's more, in my opinion, best military advice should not be narrowly limited to technical military matters. When the chairman offers his best military advice, he's not simply offering the best advice about the military, but rather the best advice from the military. And that extends to issues of national security policy, strategy, and operations. For example, the decision to take our nation to war properly rests with civilians. It's a policy question, but military officers should not be prohibited from voicing their advice on such a matter. Indeed, it is their duty to do so. If you haven't seen Mr. Burns' series on Vietnam, I suggest that you pay attention to it, and I suggest that you examine the tensions that existed between the civilian superiors and the military. And I believe that you will come to the conclusion that the military advice was not given the weight and effect that it should have, which was one of the factors in leading to 58,000 names on the wall in granite not too far from here. Just as we are clear about what constitutes best military advice, we must be equally clear about its limitation. Advice is just that, advice. The chairman as principal military advisor is not in the chain of command. Ours is not a general staff system. In our system, operational command rests with combatant commanders who report by law to the Secretary of Defense. The chairman must also advise civilian leaders on the military dimensions of strategy, operations, and plans, both within and among our combatant commander's area of responsibility, and it is his right, indeed his responsibility, to provide competing advice to policymakers when he disagrees with combatant commanders. But the chairman is not an operational commander. Similarly, best military advice does not mean independent advice. It occurs in the context of civil-military relations, and I want to say a few words on this in closing. Professor Elliott Cohen has described civil-military relations as an unequal dialogue. Civilian and military rules are not to be dichotomized and held apart. Rather, they must be brought together through an iterative process of discussing, scrutinizing, and refining military strategy, operations, and plans, a process in which civilian leaders must play an active role and make the major decisions. Best military advice is central to this dialogue, but it can never replace it. Unfortunately, I sense that this civil-military dialogue has become strained. At times, civilian officials have disrespected military leaders, disregarded their advice on critical military matters, and shirked accountability for their decisions. More recently, civilian oversight and control of the military has morphed into meddling and micromanagement of tactical details for political purposes, which has harmed military effectiveness. The last administration distinguished itself in this regard. What we must guard against, General Dunford, especially now, when so many civilian leaders at the Department of Defense are either missing or are themselves recently retired military officers, is an overcorrection. We cannot afford to swing from civilian micromanagement to civilian marginalization. We need to restore balance in civil-military relations where best military advice is always rendered and received, but is done so as part of a dialogue with civilians who participate actively and have the last word on policy, strategy, operations, and plans. This committee takes its obligations seriously in this regard. The civil-military dialogue does not only occur within the Department of Defense, it occurs between the branches of government as well. That's why the chairman also serves as a principal military advisor to the Congress. And that's why, as part of the confirmation process, we ask current and future chairmen, like all military officers, to provide their best personal advice to this committee if asked. It is to ensure that the members of this committee and the full Congress are able to meet our independent constitutional responsibilities to the Americans we serve. At present, this committee and the Congress more broadly is not receiving the information and respect it deserves as a co-equal branch of government. We do not work for the president or the executive branch. We have distinct and equal responsibilities under the Constitution, and the administration needs to understand its obligation to the Congress in this regard. Too often, members of this committee are learning in the media for the first time about major national security and military activities that we, as the Committee of Oversight, should be told about and consulted on in advance. Even now, nearly 10 months into this year, we are told we have a new strategy for Afghanistan, but members of this committee have far more questions than answers. The administration must do better, and until it does, the Congress and this committee will be forced to use what levers we have to show the administration that we are not and will not be a rubber stamp. We will have many questions for you, General. We look forward to your candid, forthright, and best military advice. Senator Reid.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I also want to welcome General Dunford this morning and thank you for his outstanding service to this nation over many years. General Dunford is joined by his wife Ellen and son Patrick. Thank you. And also like to acknowledge the General's other children, Joe and Kathleen, who are not able to join us today. And on behalf of our committee, we thank the entire Dunford family for their continued sacrifice and support. It means a great deal to us, but more particularly to the men and women of the armed forces. Thank you. Under the leadership of Chairman McCain, this committee has maintained a robust hearing schedule focused on the most pressing threats and challenges facing our armed forces. Our committee has heard from the most senior political leaders in the department, the highest echelons of the military, and distinguished outside experts. Time and again, these hearings have underscored that the United States is faced with a myriad of challenges that offer no quick or easy solutions and require adroit military leadership. During General Dunford's tenure as chairman, he has provided sound military counsel and demonstrated a deep understanding of the national security threats our nation must address. As chairman, General Dunford has made it a priority to keep this committee well informed on the department's policy decisions impacting our armed forces and changes to our military strategy to counter the risks posed by our adversaries. While this committee may not always agree with General Dunford's views, he has been honest and conducted himself with integrity. Therefore, I believe he should be reappointed to serve as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. As we pause to consider the state of the world today, General Dunford's professionalism and commitment to duty have served him well. This is not the first time in our nation's history that we have had to confront multiple threats from abroad, but it is an incredibly dangerous and uncertain time. North Korea's nuclear missile program poses an immediate and grave national security threat, and heightened tensions on the peninsula are a deep cause for concern. The global order established by the United States following World War II is under siege by a revanchist Russia determined to reassert its influence around the world. China continues its saber-rattling in the Asia-Pacific region by undermining the freedom of navigation and using economic coercion of its smaller, more vulnerable neighbors. Iran continues their aggressive weapons development activities, including ballistic missile development efforts, as well as other destabilizing activities in the region. Finally, our military has been consumed by two prolonged wars against violent extremist groups like ISIS that has sapped readiness and precluded our military personnel from training for full-spectrum operations. As we grapple with these threats, we must also be mindful that our President continues to show a lack of in-depth knowledge or nuance in foreign policy and defense matters. It had been my sincere hope that the magnitude of the office, coupled with the enormous challenges we face, would have encouraged the President to be more judicious with his comments and thoughtful with his actions. Unfortunately, that has not been the case. To date, our foreign policy has been predicated on alienating longtime allies, discounting the value of international organizations and our global commitments, and retreating from our leadership role in the world, while at the same time, decisions on our defense posture and complicated military personnel issues are promulgated by presidential tweet. Such trends lend more uncertainty to already dangerous times, and I believe the risk of miscalculation and unintended consequences have never been higher. Resolute leadership at the highest echelons of our military is a necessity, now more than ever. I commend General Dunford for the steady hand he has demonstrated in guiding the Joint Chiefs during his tenure as chairman, and for the sterling example he has set for all those that wear the uniform. Thank you again, General Dunford, for your willingness to serve our nation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
General Dunford, welcome.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman McCain, Ranking Member Reed, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I'm honored to be renominated as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I'd like to begin by thanking the committee for your support of our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. This year's National Defense Authorization Act is a reflection of your commitment to ensure that they remain the most well-trained, well-equipped, and capable military force in the world. Today, we have a competitive advantage over any adversary, and I can say with confidence that our armed forces are ready to protect the homeland and meet our alliance commitments. However, that advantage has eroded in recent years. If reconfirmed, I look forward to working together with the committee to ensure that the chairman testifying in 2025 has the same degree of confidence in our ability to provide for the common defense. This committee is keenly aware of today's complex and volatile security environment. Both the chairman and the ranking member have mentioned it, and I don't expect the strategic landscape to improve in the near future. Russia continues to invest in a full range of capabilities designed to limit our power projection, erode U.S. influence, and undermine the credibility of the NATO alliance. Similarly, China is focused on limiting our ability to project power and weakening our alliances in the Pacific. Iran is projecting malign influence across the Middle East, threatening freedom of navigation while supporting terrorist organizations in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. And while we're all focused on the destabilizing threat posed by North Korea and Kim Jong-un's relentless pursuit of a nuclear intercontinental ballistic missile that can threaten the United States, we are also confronted by al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other trans-regional terrorist organizations. And while we've made significant progress against core ISIS in Iraq and Syria, we are not complacent, and much work remains to be done. In Afghanistan, we are beginning to deploy additional U.S. and coalition forces in support of the President's broader South Asia strategy. In the context of these and other challenges, we need a renewed focus to restore joint readiness and develop the warfighting capabilities we'll need to defend the nation in the future. As this committee has highlighted in hearings, we face very real and significant readiness challenges today, and we have failed to adequately invest in the future. I can't state it any clearer. If we don't address this dynamic with sustained, sufficient, and predictable funding over the course of several years, we will lose our qualitative and quantitative competitive advantage. In the end, this will have a profound effect on our ability to deter conflict and to respond effectively if deterrence fails. If reconfirmed, I'll commit to working with the administration and the Congress in addressing these challenges to ensure our men and women in uniform never find themselves in a fair fight. Chairman, I listened very carefully to your opening statement. I fully understand my responsibilities to provide candid best military advice to the President, the Secretary of Defense, and the National Security Council, and I'll be forthright when I'm asked to appear before this committee and other congressional venues. And with that, I'm prepared to answer your questions.
Well, thank you very much, General. In June, you testified without sustained, sufficient, and predictable funding. I assess that within 5 years, we will lose our ability to project power. We still don't have sustained, sufficient, and predictable funding, and as you mentioned, I'm not sure we will for the foreseeable future unless Congress finally steps up to do its job. As you know, we'll start fiscal year 2018 on a continuing resolution with no insight into what the final funding levels will be for the year. What's the effect of the average first lieutenant who's out there, captain, has a company command, and they don't have sufficient funds to carry out their training regimen, and their pilots are flying less hours per month than their Chinese and Russian counterparts. First of all, what effect does that have on our ability to defend the nation? And second of all, what does it do to the men and women of the all-volunteer force?
Chairman, I'll answer the first part. When you say what does it do to our ability to defend the nation, and when I in my opening remarks I mentioned competitive advantage, and we've done some very careful analysis about where are the current threats, and we use largely Russia and China to benchmark our capabilities. And if you go back to 1999 or 2000, we had what we should have as the United States of America, a nation that thinks and acts globally. We had a significant competitive advantage in our ability to project power when and where needed to advance our national interests. I can't say that today. We are challenged in our ability to project power both to Europe and in the Pacific as a result of those threats. And other nations, to include non-state actors as well, have capabilities on the high end that challenge our ability to project power. So over time, that has eroded. With regard to the question about lieutenants and captains, I think I have some insight into that in the sense that I was a platoon commander in the late 1970s, and I lived through a period of time when we weren't properly resourced, we didn't have sufficient money for training, we didn't have sufficient personnel, and many times the tasks that we were asked exceeded our capability. I think it has to do with the confidence, and I would give you an example of a pilot. If you look at a pilot specifically, in the past, pilots might have had 30 hours a month to fly. Now they may be down as low as 15 hours a month. On a day-to-day basis, you may not be able to see the difference between pilot A and pilot B. But if there is an in-flight emergency, I can guarantee you that the pilot that has 30 hours will immediately feel much more comfortable and confident in their ability to deal with an anomalous situation, be able to control their physiological response. And you and I may never find out about that incident. On the contrary, if a pilot has 15 hours a month, we may very well find out about it because it's a Class A mishap.
And our non-combat casualties and fatalities are now higher than in operations than in combat.
Chairman, they are, and I would attribute that to two things. I mean, one, it's the material condition that does affect the numbers of hours that a pilot flies, a driver drives, so forth. It's also the size of the force relative to the requirements that we have. Going back to my lieutenant days, if you think about training, whether it's on a ship, in a plane, or in the infantry as a series of 101, 201, 301, 401 tasks, when I was a lieutenant, we didn't go to 201 until we were confident that we were well-founded in 101, and we didn't go to 301 until we were well-founded in 201. And I would argue that, well, we may have trained a standard in the past when we had sufficient time and resources. Now we're training at time because that ship is going to go to sea, that pilot is going to go to war, that infantryman is going to go to war, whether or not they've had an opportunity to retrain sometimes in their basic tasks or not.
Do you believe it's possible for the United States to achieve its national security objectives in Afghanistan as long as Pakistan provides support and sanctuary to groups such as the Taliban and the Haqqani Network?
I do not believe that we can attain our objectives in Afghanistan, Chairman, unless we materially change the behavior of Pakistan.
And have you got thoughts on how you do that?
Chairman, well, it will require a broad approach to do it. I think it's unacceptable that you hit the key issue. It's unacceptable that Pakistan provides sanctuary, and we ought to bring the full weight of the U.S. government and our coalition partners on Pakistan to ensure that they do not provide the sanctuary that they have provided historically to groups like Haqqani and the Taliban.
Are you satisfied now with the rules of engagement which have been changed with the new administration?
Chairman, I am, and I had a long conversation with General Nicholson and NATO over the weekend to ensure that he also had the same degree of confidence. Secretary Mattis has spoken to General Nicholson in the past week to make sure he's confident that he has the rules of engagement that allow him to engage any enemy that is a threat to the Afghan government, our mission, coalition forces, or U.S. personnel.
Is some of it reminiscent of our rules of engagement during the Vietnam conflict?
Well, Chairman, they may have been. I can assure you today that we have the rules of engagement necessary to advance our objectives in Afghanistan and to protect the force as well.
Thank you. Senator Reid.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, General Dunford. In response to the committee's pre-hearing policy questions, you indicated that Iran is adhering to its obligations under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, of the JCPOA, but you do rightfully point out that they are engaged in extremely destabilizing activities in the region, missile development, activities that can't be tolerated. But going back to JCPOA, is it your view that it was designed to limit their nuclear capacity and that it is currently achieving that objective?
Senator, it was designed specifically to address what I would describe as one of the 5 major threats of Iran, the nuclear threat. As you point out, what the agreement didn't address was the missile threat, the maritime threat, Iran's support of proxies, and the cyber activity that they have conducted.
And they're still pursuing those other venues very aggressively, in your view?
They are, Senator, and we see a physical manifestation of that in Yemen. We see it in Iraq. We see it in Lebanon. We see it in Syria.
In this complicated world where there's so much going on, we have our focus on North Korea. If we were to step away from the JCPOA, would that have an effect, in your professional view, on the ability to negotiate or to come to some type of non-kinetic solution in Korea?
Senator, it makes sense to me that our holding up agreements that we have signed, unless there's a material breach, would have an impact on others' willingness to sign agreements.
And in terms of a force that we've all comment on is stretched, if in reaction to rejecting the JCPOA, would you assume that the Iranians would step up their activity even more, causing us to at least in a contingency have forces that would be in that area and not available for Korea?
Senator, I would. We watch every day, and this is even in addition to the JCPOA issue, just our relationship with Iran. We watch every day for indicators that either Iranian-backed militia forces or Iranian maritime forces would pose a threat to the force. We have postured the force to deal with those threats, and we watch the intelligence carefully to make sure our posture every day is in the context of the current threat.
You've said it, and the Secretary of Defense has said it, and the White House has said it too, is that our major effort against North Korea is diplomatic at this moment. Is that accurate?
The military dimension today is in full support of the economic and diplomatic pressure campaign that Secretary of State is leading in North Korea.
One of the things that's difficult to comprehend is we do not have an ambassador in South Korea, do we?
We do not. We have a charge at this time, Senator.
And in effect, General Brooks is sort of doing double duty informally?
No, Senator, we're very proud of what General Brooks is doing right now as both he sits there at the nexus of the political military.
No, I'm very, as you have confidence in General Brooks, but if we're in a diplomatic mode, we don't have an ambassador until we don't also have an assistant secretary for the area in the State Department. We just don't seem to have the team in place to have an all-court press for a diplomatic solution. Is that unfair comment, or?
Senator, I certainly probably would comment on it only because I have clearly heard Secretary Tillerson also comment on the difficulty he has right now doing all the things that the State Department's been called upon to do with some of the gaps that continue to exist.
In terms of the situation on the peninsula now, can you give us your judgment of where we are today, given the statements back and forth between leaders of both countries, given our aerial operations off the coast, given the response yesterday that could trigger a reaction by the North Koreans? Can you give us an assessment?
Senator, I can. While the political space is clearly very charged right now, we haven't seen a change in the posture of North Korean forces. We watched that very carefully. We clearly have postured our forces to respond in the event of a provocation or a conflict. We also have taken all the proper measures to protect our allies, the South Koreans, the Japanese, the force, as well as Americans in the area. But what we haven't seen is military activity that would be reflective of the charged political environment that you're describing.
Thank you very much, John.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Dunford, I'd like to pursue two things, one intelligence and the other modernization. In doing this, I want to get three statements in the record. To begin with, on Sunday, Kim Jong-un released a propaganda video depicting the U.S. aircraft carrier and bomber being blown up by North Korean missiles. He further threatened that a U.S. attack would see our forces, as he said, head to the grave. I've been very proud of the uniforms coming out and talking about how real the threat is. General Hyten, the Strategic Command commander, said last week that he views North Korea's ability to deliver a nuclear weapon on an ICBM as a matter of when, not if. And Defense Intelligence Agency assesses that North Korea will be able to reliably range the U.S. mainland with nuclear ICBMs by the end of 2018. Well, I remember when that 2018 was 2020 and it was 2019. I'd have to ask you how confident you are in our intelligence community's ability to monitor and detect just where they are and how accurate you believe that end of 2018 is.
Senator, from my review of the intelligence, I think that what General Hyten said and what you've just described reflects the collective judgment of the senior leadership in the department. And I think something that General Hyten said is something I've also said in public is that whether it's 3 months or 6 months or 18 months, it is soon. And we ought to conduct ourselves as though it is just a matter of time and a matter of a very short time before North Korea has that capability.
Yeah, and I think it's important to get in the record. Name a couple of the unique challenges in getting intelligence on North Korea that don't exist in other places.
They may exist to some degree in other places. The North Koreans over time have buried much of their capability underground, which creates unique challenges. There's also some specific weather challenges in North Korea that limits our collection at various periods of time. And to be honest with you, Senator, part of it also has been the competing demand for a limited amount of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Certainly over the last 18 months, we have increased our collection against North Korea, but for a long period of time we had decreased our collection against North Korea because of competing demands elsewhere in the world. So I think those are probably three of the most significant challenges we face.
That's good. And I assume you're equally concerned about their activity in trading technology and missile technology with other countries, such as Iran.
Senator, we are. We've looked at that nexus quite a bit. I'm not sure we've seen any transfer of nuclear technology, but we certainly have seen missile technology and a wide range of other weapon systems that they have exported or expertise that they have exported outside of North Korea.
Okay, on modernization, both of the Army Generals Anderson and Murray said recently in our subcommittee, given the complex range of threats, the Army has a very short window to improve capability and capacity. Meanwhile, our adversaries are closing the capacity gap. I think you said, if I wrote it down correctly, you said if we don't have sustained funding, we'll lose our qualitative and quantitative advantage over our adversaries. I think that is accurate. And you've expressed your concern that we're getting very close on that. Is that correct?
I have, Senator, and I think this reflects both the Chinese, the Russians, and others have studied our strengths over the course now of 20 years. Yeah. They've been on a path of developing capabilities that exploit our vulnerabilities, and we know what those are, and we have a plan to correct those. But if we don't correct those, our ability to project power, for example, when the Army talks about it, our ability to project power into Europe, but then operate freely within Europe, to include to support our forces with logistics bases, sustainment efforts, is going to be challenged.
And I think your statement, along with some of the other military, some of the uniforms, are helpful to us because the American people really don't understand the level of threat that's out there, the complexity of it, how it's not something that's happened before, and that we need to start prioritizing our military and our defense issues. One last thing, General Milley recently testified during the 18 Army posture hearing that we are now outranged and outgunned. Do you agree with that statement?
Relative to certain threats under certain conditions, I do, Senator.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Gillibrand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, General Dunford, for your service. The uncertainty that's facing our transgender men and women in uniform since late July has been deeply unsettling to many members of the committee. Chairman McCain, Ranking Member Reed, Senator Susan Collins, and I have introduced a bipartisan bill that would prevent the Department of Defense from separating currently serving transgender individuals solely based on their gender identity. These men and women across all services and occupations were told by the Department of Defense that they would be allowed to serve openly and continue in their military careers. Many have worked diligently within their chains of command to meet every requirement put forth by the former administration. Now they have been plunged into a career of uncertainty, and their service and sacrifices have been unfairly tarnished. Many of us on the committee are deeply disturbed by the developments of the last few months. Do you agree that our thousands of openly serving transgender men and women have served their country with honor and valor?
I do, Senator. I would just probably say that I believe any individual who meets the physical and mental standards and is worldwide deployable and is currently serving should be afforded the opportunity to continue to serve.
Thank you. If reappointed, can you promise currently serving transgender individuals who have followed department policy and meet every requirement, as you just said, asked of them, that they will not be separated from the armed services based solely on their gender identity?
Senator, I can promise that that will be my advice. What I've just articulated is the advice I've provided in private and I've just provided in public.
Thank you. And have you had the opportunity to meet with any of the thousands of transgender individuals currently serving in uniform on active duty to hear how the recent developments have impacted their lives? And if not, will you commit to doing so?
I have not since I guess August when the announcement was made, but I would certainly do that, Senator.
Thank you. On the subject of military sexual violence, we've been at this for a while now. Every Secretary of Defense since Dick Cheney was Secretary of Defense have said zero tolerance for sexual assault in the military. But we still have serious issues of climate. Our assault rate is still 15,000 estimated assaults, sexual acts, and unwanted sexual contact. But we really aren't moving the needle in the way we should. During a hearing over the last few years, we had General Dempsey, who said in 2014, he said that we are currently on the clock, if you will. If we don't make serious progress in a year, we might have to look at legislation. Now, more than half of the Senate has voted twice to take the decision-making of whether a crime has been committed out of the chain of command and giving it to trained military prosecutors as a way to professionalize our military justice system. This is a reform that our allies have already done long ago, mostly for defendants' rights, whether it's the UK, whether it's Israel, whether it's Australia, Canada, Netherlands. And they've done it purposefully because they believe that if someone could be sent to jail for life, that the decision maker who makes those decisions should be well trained as a criminal prosecutor, have no biases, not know the perpetrator or the victim, the accused or the accuser, and have that criminal justice background so that they can leave biases at the door. We've done every type of reform that has been recommended by every panel that's been impaneled to look at this. We have special victims councils in place to give survivors more legal advice during the process. We have changed the rules of evidence to make them more similar to the civilian system, so there's more protections. We have done literally anything anyone can think of that the Department of Defense will not oppose. We've made retaliation a crime 3 years in a row. Not one case has gone to court-martial of retaliation of the hundreds of cases I've looked at. The largest basis for each of the services, I look at all the sexual assault cases every year and do a broad-based review. So we're not fixing the problem. I would like a commitment from you that you will work with me on ways to fix this problem and to honestly look at this command structure, because more often than not, the decisions that are made aren't necessarily the right decisions. Using non-judicial punishment when going to court-martial is recommended by those who have done the investigation. Kicking somebody out who has many witnesses against them instead of taking them to court-martial. These are kinds of decisions that are not making our military stronger. So I would like your commitment that you will work with me on this issue this year to try to make a difference to solve this problem.
Senator, I don't think any of us are satisfied where we are, and I would commit to work with you to look at this issue.
Thank you.
General, let me just say that this committee has had hundreds of hours of hearings, input from leaders such as yourself. This issue has been thoroughly vetted by this committee. The Secretary of Defense is looking at this issue and others, and I am convinced that the one aspect of this issue that this chairman will not tolerate, and that is to undermine or cause the commanding officer not to have both authority and responsibility in this process. I just want to make that very clear to you, the position of the majority of this committee. We've got a lot of work to do on the issue, but to take away the commanding officer's authority and responsibility would be a violation of everything I've ever known about the United States Navy for 70 years.
Chairman, can I respond
Please.
to both you and Senator Gillibrand? I mean, I'm on record as having said, and I believe this, that we will not solve the problem unless commanding officers are singularly, personally accountable and responsible for command climate and for fixing the problem. What I answer to Senator Gillibrand, just to be clear and to be honest today, is to continue to look at the issue and find ways to address sexual assault. I was not referring to the chain of command not being responsible or accountable. My experience is similar to yours over the last 40 years, that any problem we have ever had inside of the organization has been solved when commanders were engaged, responsible, and accountable for solving that problem.
Well, I thank you for that statement, General, and we will continue to debate it. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done, as I think you'd be the first to acknowledge. But to say that commanding officers no longer have responsibility for the conduct of those under their command undermines about 200 and some years of military chain of command and responsibility. If commanding officers are not carrying out those responsibilities, then they should be, then their lack of assumption of responsibility they should be held accountable to. But to take them out of the chain of responsibility, in my view, is a serious, serious mistake. Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, General Dunford, for being here today and for your continued service. On July 4th and July 28th, North Korea tested a new missile now known as the KN-20. And based on the capabilities demonstrated in these tests, numerous press reports estimate that the missile has a potential range of over 10,000 miles, which would put much of the United States within its reach. And while I understand technical hurdles still remain before North Korea possess a reliable, accurate, and nuclear-capable ICBM system, what's your assessment of the ballistic missile threat to the homeland from North Korea? Where do you see that trend line moving?
Senator, I think for all planning purposes, capability development, we should assume now that North Korea has the capability. As you suggest, there are some technical elements of their program that haven't been fully tested, from a re-entry vehicle to some of the ability to stabilize a missile in flight. But I view all those as engineering solutions that will be developed over time. And frankly, I think we should assume today that North Korea has that capability and has the will to use that capability.
The last major modification of our homeland missile defenses came in 2013, when, in response to an accelerating threat from North Korea, then-Secretary Hagel announced plans to increase the number of interceptors from 30 to 44. And given what we've witnessed over the past year, do you believe that the current threat environment requires additional homeland missile defense capabilities?
I do, Senator, and over the last 7 or 8 weeks, we did a very detailed look at increasing ballistic missile defense capability for the North Korean threat, certainly, but for other threats as well. And we do think an increase is warranted. And I believe in the NDAA, and we certainly support that. There's an additional 21 interceptors that are in the NDAA that was just passed.
Right. And should the department program additional resources towards ballistic missile defense across the FIDEP?
Senator, we should, and both the Congress and the President have directed us to do that, and we have.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up on some previous questions that I think we were trying to get to what happens when operational demands aren't necessarily met. As you know, we conducted a hearing recently on the naval accidents that are happening in the Pacific, and we looked at the concern that the Navy is trying to do too much with too little. Demand's outpacing the supply. That's what we're seeing. And I don't think it's just focused on the Navy. I think there's concerns with other services as well. We know the Navy's doing its reviews, and I think those really focus on the supply side of the equation on that. Can you tell me if the Joint Staff is reviewing the operational demands that have been placed on the Navy, and have these incidents have an impact on the way that we are looking at how to assess a high op-tempo, how that poses a risk to our forces now?
Senator, we have reviewed that, and what we're making sure now is that readiness of the force, as well as our ability to respond to the unexpected, is a key element, even as we meet the requirements. You know, in the past, without going into a lot of detail, we had a bottom-up process for global force management, meaning each one of the commanders provided us with all their requirements, and then we kind of leveled across and met all those requirements. We have now implemented, and this year we'll implement it for the first time, a top-down process where we fence certain numbers of forces as a result of the services needing those forces to be back in the United States to generate readiness, or somewhere else located where they are generating readiness and not allocated, so we can continue to sustain the force. We realize that what we've been doing in the past is unsustainable moving forward. The demand does exceed the supply, and we need to make an adjustment to the demand as well as the supply, as you alluded to, Senator.
Do you anticipate reducing the demand?
I anticipate managing risk in a different way until we can grow the capacity to meet the demand. I do.
Does that put more of a threat on the readiness of our troops then? I mean, they're not just take the Navy. They're not just out there on ships doing operations with no strategy in place.
They are not, Senator, but what we have to do is get to the point where we have a balance between the time that units are at home station training, developing their capabilities, and the time they're deployed. If you talk about the Navy example, I was aboard the USS Barry some months ago. The USS Barry had been at sea 70% of the time in the previous 12 months. So when we go back now and we look at were they able to do all the training necessary and what was their life like during those 12 months, 70% of the time underway is an unsustainable rate. And so we're going to have to make adjustments in the demand that will incur managing operational and strategic risk, there's no doubt.
Thank you.
And it also include 100-hour work weeks.
Chairman, absolutely. And when sailors are at sea 70% of the time, they're at work most of every day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Dunford, I want to thank you for your leadership, your continued service to our nation, and to your family. Thank you very much. I think you've done an extraordinary job, and we're privileged to have you in this position. In your written responses to the committee's questions in advance of this hearing, you addressed a few of my questions about improving mental health and suicide prevention services. You highlighted the growth in embedded mental health providers. The FY15 NDAA included a bipartisan provision called the Sexton Act that I authored with Senator Wicker. It requires every service member to get a confidential mental health assessment each year. In the past, you and the service chiefs have said that you believed it would be fully implemented no later than October 1 of this year, which is next week. General, are the services fully implementing the requirements for robust annual mental health assessments.
Senator, thank you. And as you know, I've worked that issue personally now for some years, and I appreciate your support in that area. The Army, the National Guard, several of our components are completely compliant, and they'll make the deadline. There are some outliers that haven't met the standard, and I was aware of that as I prepared for my testimony, so I can assure you that both the Secretary and I will be engaged in cleaning it up. I think the vast majority of the department has become compliant with the Sexton Act, but there are some outliers, and we'll get the full details to you. I became aware of that this week as we prepared for testimony.
Thank you. Can you describe your understanding of our strategy to counter North Korea and how you're working with your partners across interagency to execute that?
I can, Senator. And very briefly, when Secretary Tillerson came in last year, people told him that there were two things that he couldn't do anything about. One was that nuclear weapons were inextricably linked to survival of the regime in North Korea. They wouldn't trade away nuclear weapons. And the second is that China wouldn't cooperate. Secretary Tillerson is testing those two assumptions because the alternatives at the time to not testing those two assumptions were so dire. So we have now a pressurization campaign applying economic and diplomatic means primarily to force the North Koreans to denuclearize the peninsula. We are also working very closely with the Chinese. Secretary Tillerson has been almost relentless in dealing with the Chinese over the past few months to get them cooperate with the UN sanctions regime. On the positive side, there's been four UN resolutions passed this year, and I think the Chinese cooperation, to include the Russian cooperation in passing those sanctions, is unprecedented. We're at the phase now where implementation of the sanctions is going to determine whether or not we have a peaceful solution to denuclearization on the peninsula. So we are continuing with the military dimension to support primarily Secretary Tillerson's economic and diplomatic pressure campaign, but also making it clear that there are military options available to the President if the economic and diplomatic pressure campaign fails. We think that's important that North Korea understand that. We also think it's important that China understand that. And I personally went to China in the middle of August during the recess to deliver that message to Chinese senior leadership.
When you look at North Korea, and there's significant speculation about Kim Jong-un's motives, but do you think it's about just survival of the regime, or do you think he is also looking to take over South Korea as well?
Senator, I look back at our experience with North Korea, and I realized that Kim Jong-un has only been there for a short period of the history. Since 1953, we have effectively deterred North Korea from attacking south or attacking into South Korea. My assessment, based on the intelligence I've read, is that Kim Jong-un's development of nuclear capability and his development of missile technology is primarily associated with regime survival. That's not to say that they don't pose a threat to South Korea and to others in the region, but my judgment is that that is what has driven his path of development over the past 18 months.
Switching over a little bit to Syria, you've had significant success in Iraq, moving ISIS out. There's ongoing battles in the Raqqa area. 6 months from now, where do you hope to be?
6 months from now, Senator, I guess from experience, always cautious about laying out timelines, and so I won't for the campaign. But I do believe that we will have completed operations more properly. Our partners will have completed operations in Raqqa, and we'll be well on our way to going after the external operations capability and immediate capability of ISIS that remains in the middle Euphrates River Valley. And we'll also be supporting our Iraqi security forces partners on the east side of the border to better secure the border between Iraq and Syria. So I think we'll have continued to degrade, most importantly, their external operations capability, the ability they have to plan and conduct external operations. I think we'll have undermined the credibility of the narrative. They will increasingly not be able to say that there's a physical caliphate in existence. I think that'll have an impact on the recruiting. We've already seen the numbers drop, the numbers of individuals who are inspired to join the ISIS movement. So I think we'll continue to see reduction in territory, reduction in freedom of movement, reduced resources, and less credibility in the narrative. Those are the four areas where I think we'll continue to see progress.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
can ask what your take is on the vote in Kurdistan?
Chairman, in the wake of that vote, my primary concern now is making sure that the vote doesn't disrupt the cooperation that we have seen between the Peshmerga and Iraqi security forces. The real challenge in the campaign right now is that operations in the north, the reason why we were successful in Mosul, the reason we're successful in the north is because of the cooperation between the Peshmerga and Iraqi security forces. If you look at the next area that the Iraqis are focused on in the Hawija area, which is southwest of Kirkuk, it's going to require cooperation between the Kurds and Iraqi security forces. So I'm concerned that the referendum will disrupt that cooperation, but my focus from a military perspective will be to try to mitigate the effects, and I know that's what Secretary...
Aggressive statements.
President Erdogan has made some very aggressive statements, and so have the Iranians, Chairman.
Senator Cott.
General, welcome back.
For some period of time. So in those three areas, I would say that Syria is the one place where it's probably increased. And you could argue over the last few months whether or not it's related to JICPO or not, that Iranian activity inside of Iraq has certainly increased as they look to the end game in Iraq.
Thank you. Without going into the content of rules of engagement, which are obviously classified, have our rules of engagement changed in the last 8 months since President Trump took office in the Persian Gulf as it relates to Iranian harassment using small craft or drones or aircraft?
Our rules of engagement have not changed, Senator. What we have done in the wake of a number of incidents is we've gone back at every level from the Fifth Fleet to the United States Central Command and made it very clear what our forces were capable of doing were they to be threatened. And so I'm confident that it's in application of rules of engagement, if our forces are threatened, they are both postured and capable of effectively responding.
Thank you. On page 29 and 30 of your written testimony, you restate your support for our nuclear triad, as well as modernizing the National Airborne Operations Command Center. Strangely, to me, the Air Force has just announced that the next version of Air Force One will not have in-flight refueling capability. What do you make of that?
Senator, I think that was a decision that was not made by the Air Force, but made by the White House, and I think it had to do with fiscal constraints on the program. That will certainly be a limiting factor, and we'll have to plan accordingly.
I think we might need to revisit that decision here on Capitol Hill. I want to turn to the Open Skies Treaty. Not many Americans know about that, but it allows the United States and Russia and many other countries, but primarily those two countries, to fly aircraft over each other's territory and to take lots of pictures. Russia has been violating that treaty, as Secretary Mattis testified earlier this year. I assume that you agree with his testimony from earlier this year.
I do, Senator, and we as a nation declared them in violation back in June.
And there's a Wall Street Journal article today saying that in Vienna today, we will take steps to curb their flights in response to their actions by limiting our flights over Kaliningrad, their enclave in Europe, at which they held most of Europe at risk, their limitations in Abkhazia and South Ossetia and Chechnya, and also their altitude floor over Moscow. Are those steps that we're about to take?
Those are all part of an overall effort. Senator, let me probably just make sure that we make it clear. We believe that on balance it would be best if the treaty continued to be in place. But we don't believe the treaty should be in place if the Russians aren't compliant. And so there is a decidedly aggressive diplomatic effort right now to bring the Russians back into compliance, which we think would be the best outcome.
Do you expect some of these reported steps, for instance, restricting flights over Alaska and Hawaii, will bring Russia back into compliance?
Senator, I don't know, but this is the best plan we have right now to bring them in compliance before we may consider other alternatives.
Given the size and capabilities of our satellite constellation versus Russia's, is it fair to say that Russia gets more benefit from these flights than does the United States?
I believe that argument's been made, and it's compelling to me.
I want to turn to missile defense in North Korea. We focus a lot on systems like Aegis Ashore and THAAD, or our West Coast interceptors. What's the prospects currently for boost phase intercepts, specifically from unmanned aerial vehicles, either with hit-to-kill interceptors or with directed energy?
Senator, there's been a lot of work done on boost phase. As you know from asking the question, we don't have that capability right now. I would offer to you a classified briefing at a time of your convenience to walk you through where we think we may be right now, but we do not have that capability today.
I think we have that scheduled for later today. Be a hell of a thing if we could put a UAV up over the North Korean peninsula and shoot down any missile as it was taking off. I'd suggest that we need to look as aggressively as we can at that. Finally, General, the deaths of the sailors in the Western Pacific has commanded a lot of attention, rightfully so. You had, I believe, 15 Marines that were badly wounded a couple weeks ago out on the West Coast, though, in a fire involving an amphibious assault vehicle. How are those Marines doing today?
Senator, I don't know how each one of them individually is doing, but we've been getting routine reports about their progress, and they are making progress. So some of them, some significant injuries.
I know that the Marine Corps is conducting a review of the matter and will have a report. What's the likelihood that the impact of the many years of sequestration budget cuts could have played a role in either the level of training or operations and maintenance for that vehicle in this incident?
Senator, I can't talk to that specific incident, but I am confident that a combination of fiscal challenges and high operational tempo have created conditions that actually have led to some of these incidents. Of that, I'm confident.
Thank you, General.
Senator Rono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Dunford, welcome back. And it was a pleasure to meet with you not too long ago. And with the natural disasters that have been occurring, I also want to take this opportunity to thank the many members of our armed forces, including the active National Guard and Reserve personnel who were very instrumental in helping to save lives and transporting supplies during the recent natural disasters. General Dunford, in your 2015 confirmation hearing to serve as chairman, you stated that Russia presented the greatest threat to our national security, and you included their nuclear capability, ability to interfere with our sovereignty of our allies, and you said their behavior was nothing short of alarming. And of course, we can now add involvement in our elections to the list. You then rank-ordered China, North Korea, and ISIL as 2 to 4 on your list of threats to national security. In the intervening time, we have North Korea. So my question, as we sit here today, would you change your threat assessment order? Is North Korea still 3rd on your list?
Senator, the one thing I've said to my staff is that we don't actually have the luxury of identifying a single threat today, unfortunately, nor necessary to look at it in a linear fashion. So what I would say is that in terms of a sense of urgency today, North Korea certainly poses the greatest threat today. In terms of overall military capability, I believe Russia poses the greatest threat because of the nuclear, cyber, electronic warfare, and the activity that we've seen from the Crimea to the Ukraine. If I look out to 2025, and I look at the demographics and the economic situation, I think China probably poses the greatest threat to our nation by about 2025, and that's consistent with much of our analysis. So that's in other words, I can't look at it just in terms of overall capability, but I've got to factor in time and conditions, and when I do that, I look at all 3 of those threats in that way.
I would agree with you in terms of your assessment, and particularly with regard to North Korea being an immediate threat. I'm always asked, of course, Hawaii being in the middle of the Pacific, we feel quite vulnerable. So it is on the forefront of certainly of my minds of constituents, and particularly, of course, not just Hawaii, but Guam and Alaska. And I understand that the results of the ballistic missile defense review are expected later this year. Is that correct?
Senator, they are, but we didn't wait for the review to request increased ballistic missile defense capability. We've done that in the last couple of weeks, and also noted that in the NDAA, the committee also addressed that.
Well, I know that a large new radar system is being planned for Hawaii, and I just had a meeting with Admiral Harris, and this will take a few years, and he indicated that it would be good to move up the radar for Hawaii a year or two, and I'd really like to put that into your way of thinking so that we can get on with that radar system. I certainly want to ensure that Hawaii, Alaska, and the rest of the United States are protected. Do you, as we sit here today, are we adequately protected? Alaska, Hawaii, rest of the United States?
Senator, we are adequately protected against the current threat. And I think one of the issues that we all ought to appreciate is that as the capacity of the threat increases, that is the size, not just the lethality, not just the fact that North Korea can reach us, but the numbers of missiles that they may possess that can reach us. And what we need to be concerned about is ensuring that our ballistic missile defense capability keeps pace with that threat.
I think it's very important to have that ongoing assessment, and in particular, if we project maybe 3 years down the road, as far as North Korea's capabilities, I believe that there is an assessment occurring as to whether or not Hawaii needs a system in place besides the radar. So. That is my understanding.
Absolutely, Senator, and we are constantly assessing, and again, as recently as the last several weeks where we made some recommendations based on that assessment, our ability to protect all Americans, Guam, Hawaii, continental United States, Alaska.
I know you were asked about the JCPOA, and you state that briefings you have received indicate that Iran is adhering to its obligations under the JCPOA. My question is, as long as Iran is in compliance, is it in America's national security interest to maintain the JCPOA?
Senator, the intel community assessment is, in fact, that they are in compliance right now, and therefore I think we should focus on addressing the other challenges, the missile threat they pose, the maritime threat they pose, the support of proxies, terrorists, and the cyber threat they pose.
Yes, and those were not areas that were covered under the JCPOA.
They were not, Senator.
Yes. So is it your intent to advise the President to recertify Iran's compliance ahead of the October 15th deadline?
Senator, mindful of the Chairman's opening comments, what I would ask is if I could provide the advice that I'm providing to the President now prior to his decision to be in private, certainly share that, but not to do that publicly until after the President has made a decision.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Rounds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, first of all, thank you for your service to our country. General, the Budget Control Act is a symptom of a much larger problem Congress has been avoiding for far too long, a looming national security issue that I hope you could comment on. The Congressional Budget Office reports that by 2025, mandatory spending will be 51% higher than it is today, and interest we pay on the national debt will nearly double as a percentage of GDP. CBO projects that the impact on discretionary spending will result in about a 13% reduction to defense spending as a percentage of GDP. My question is, as the future years defense program begins to overlap the mid-2020s, has the Department of Defense started to look at how this fiscal picture might change what we can afford and where we invest? And has the potential fiscal future been accounted for in any of our future operating concepts or global power projection strategies?
Senator, our planning to date, first and foremost, has highlighted the fact that our capabilities are going to require somewhere between 3% and 7%. And we can debate that, and I'm perfectly willing to come over here with the analytic foundation for my assessment that between 3% and 7%, and that's dependent on how much risk you want to assume as you build a force, but between 3% and 7% is going to be required for us to build the capabilities we need. Where did we come up with that percentage? We looked at the capabilities of Russia and China today. We looked at the trajectory that they are on for capability development. We looked at where we are today and what investments we need to have to maintain a competitive advantage over those peer competitors. We use them as a benchmark, if you will, in the mid-2020s. What I would say, I suppose, in response to your question is that we will have to fundamentally reorder the strategy if we are unable to build the capabilities and capacities to deal with those peer competitors. Right now, what we have done is we've taken the national security strategy, we've taken initial guidance from Secretary Mattis, he'll come out later with a defense strategy after the first of the year, and we've looked at the military capabilities and capacities necessary to support those strategies. There will be a fundamental disconnect if we don't move on a path that I've just described.
And yet at the same time, as Senator Hirono has just asked, the concern right now with regard to the topic of the day, which is North Korea, and the threats that they may pose and the additional responsibilities imposed upon our military to respond to this particular country's
current activities and the threats that they suggest with regard to, the use of ICBMs against any part of our country or our allies. And so in this particular case, as you've indicated, you believe, or at least you think that right now we have the capabilities. But does that include the ability right now to protect Hawaii against an ICBM attack by North Korea? And was that planned in? And what happens when that occurs? Do we do that, and do we place our resources on that? And does that change the overall planning for the next 7 to 10 years?
Sure, Senator, based on the current capacity of the North Koreans, the current threat, so both the type of the threat and the amount of missiles that they possess, we can protect Hawaii today against an ICBM. We can protect the continental United States against an ICBM.
But it seems as though the American public simply assumed that that is just automatic, and then we've got the resources to not only respond to that and to still be able to build for the future threats, or at least to maintain our ability to defend against those future threats from our other peer competitors. And I guess that's my point is when we look at all of the different threats that are out there, the assumption that we simply have the resources right now and that we're not just keeping pace, but we are improving, is that a fair assumption on the part of the American public?
Senator, there's a few things that I wouldn't assume in the future were we not to make investments. I wouldn't assume access to space and all that means for our economy and for our military capability. I wouldn't assume our ability to protect our networks, both for commercial activity and military activity. I wouldn't assume our ability to deal with the growing electronic warfare threat of our adversaries, and I wouldn't assume the capability to deal with the growing ballistic missile and cruise missile threat of our adversaries unless we maintain pace with capability development. Those would be bad assumptions.
And that requires more than what we would otherwise find under the 2011 Budget Control Act.
There's no question. In fact, just to maybe put it in perspective, Senator, the bipartisan NDAA that you just passed is $89 billion more than what the BCA level would be, and probably some number less than what some members of the committee thought it ought to be.
Thank you, General. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And General, welcome and congratulations on the renomination. And you have done a superb job. And, my vote is going to be that you continue to do a superb job. Thank you for the service. You have testified often to us about the readiness challenges. And we had a pretty sobering hearing last week digging into the potential sources of these Navy collisions and readiness issues, and the extent of training is something that was on the table. We've had a recent report from the GAO about increased operations and extended maintenance challenges have posed real problems on the Navy side. I was with the commander of the Langley Air Force Base this weekend, and he described to me reduction in training hours as being a real challenge. So everything you have testified to us about diminished readiness resulting from the budget sequester is coming true. It wasn't, Chicken Little saying the sky is falling. What we've heard from military leaders since the sequester went into effect and the budget caps in March of 2013, we're seeing it. And I just think that it puts an additional burden on our shoulders to try to deal with it. I want to ask you about something that I'm really worried about now, which is the humanitarian crisis in Puerto Rico. So often when there's a humanitarian crisis anywhere in the world, a tsunami in Southeast Asia, an Ebola crisis in Africa, the U.S. military is there, a projection of America's humanitarian spirit. And I'm just stunned at this humanitarian challenge in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, American citizens with an amazing track record of serving in the military over generations, centuries really. Could you talk a little bit about current DOD operations to try to prevent this humanitarian crisis from really spiraling downward in a way that would be devastating to these American citizens?
Senator, thank you. In fact, one of the last things I did this morning before coming over here was go through the Northern Command update. We get those every few hours, and so I had the most recent update as of about 8:30 before I came over here to the Hill. For us, it's both professional and personal. These are Americans that need support. I've got people who have their families in Puerto Rico on my staff. One of the heads of my personal security detail until last night hadn't heard from his family yet. So this is something that's been on our minds and our thoughts and prayers with the people in Puerto Rico. The key thing that I think we are delivering right now, one of the challenges centered in getting aid has been the ports and airfields weren't accessible. And so step one is we're doing all we can do right now to increase the throughput of humanitarian supplies. That's something the U.S. military can uniquely provide. We also are providing some generators and so forth for power. We don't expect them to have power for some time, so that's something that is important that we can provide.
And this impacts hospitals and
that's
and
right.
long-term
So we have
care
generators and so
facilities
forth
that cannot afford to be without continuous power.
Absolutely, Senator, and that's why power generation and generators are one of the key areas we're focused on right now. Fresh water and food, clearly right away, and then medical capabilities. So those are the key areas that Northern Command under General Robinson's leadership are focused on right now. There's literally hourly meetings between FEMA and the government officials in Puerto Rico to make sure that we are doing all we can. The guidance from Secretary Mattis has been clear. What they need, they get. Just make it happen. And so what we're doing right now is just making sure that every place that we can uniquely contribute to the disaster in Puerto Rico, we're poised to do that. And we're anticipating what they might need next week, even if they haven't thought about it yet.
And just for purposes of committee members and the public, I think I know the answer to this, but I'm not sure I do. How was the response to Puerto Rico sort of organized? The DOD has a piece of it, but you are not necessarily the lead.
Right.
Is that sort of organized through DHS and FEMA, and then with the DOD taking on an assigned role? Is that sort of how it's being led?
That's exactly right, Senator. This is any place in the United States, and so we are in support of FEMA, and General Robinson is a supporting agency to FEMA. And so we're doing all of the support for Puerto Rico is being coordinated, as you suggest, through Department of Homeland Security and FEMA specifically. And but again, we're doing two things. We're responding to the immediate requests, but then we have a little experience in these kind of operations. And so I know what General Robinson and her team are doing also is offering things that maybe people haven't asked for today, and also looking around the corner to see what they might need next week.
Very important for us to be on this because the scale of it is just devastating, and I appreciate your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Ernst.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, General Dunford, Ellen, to you both and your family. Thank you so much for your support of our men and women in uniform. I know it's a joint effort, so thank you very much. We do agree, General, that properly resourcing a joint force really is a collaborative effort between Congress and our military and those military leaders. That is why many on this committee have pushed to repeal BCA. Senator Rounds brought up the financial implications moving forward and what sequestration might do in regards to many other issues that we're facing with our mandatory spending. But looking at that, we also need to use what we have efficiently and effectively. I'm pushing for an audit within the DOD. I think many of us support that. We need to know that our taxpayer dollars are being spent well. For your part, can you describe the steps that you have taken during your tenure as the chairman to work with that joint force and make it more efficient? Are there specific examples you can give the committee today?
There are, Senator. The first one is that we're implementing the direction that we have from the Congress to reduce our overall headquarters by 30%. That in itself is not an insignificant step that we have taken. Also, with regard, we alluded to it with global force management. What we have done is done a number of things to integrate at the strategic level the prioritization and the allocation of resources to ensure that we are deploying them most effectively and in the context of our strategic objectives. And then there's a number of things that, of course, wouldn't be something that I would do in a joint force, but certainly am familiar with in dealing with the chiefs. Business practices across the department are also an area where efficiencies are sought. The leader for that is the Deputy Secretary of Defense, and on the Joint Staff, the Vice Chairman sits with him on what's called the Defense Management Advisory Group, and that involves all of the Vice Chiefs. And there's a wide range of business practices that we're looking to be more efficient. Fortunately, we do have some expertise now from outside the department that has come in and looked at us through a different lens, and so those are areas where I think there were most promise. But the other thing I'd say, Senator, is that since 2010, we have gone through a litany of efficiency drills. And while we have gained some efficiencies, they never quite realize the savings that you expect them to, so you got to stay after it. But this isn't something that we started just in the past year. We really have, I think, in a concerted way, been after it since 2010.
Very good, General, and I am certain that you will continue that push going on as we hope to see you continuing in this position. So I thank you for that. And then in your answers to advanced policy questions, you also stressed your concern regarding our near-peer overmatch, and I share that concern as well. Unfortunately, the department will send mixed messages to Congress. On one hand, our services ask for rapid acquisition of commercial off-the-shelf systems as a solution, and on the other, then they prefer appropriating dollars forward for the next best and greatest thing. But unfortunately, a lot of times the next best, greatest thing never really materializes. So how are we going to prioritize acquisitions moving in the future?
Senator, that, as you know, is a complicated issue, and I think getting the balance right between moving out right now and buying what's available and then looking long-term for the most effective capability has been something we struggle with. On the one hand, you might quickly say, hey, we ought to just be able to go out and buy what's available and field it. Well, I can remember some years ago when we ended up with 16 links that could communicate from air to ground, but they couldn't necessarily communicate with each other. I can also remember when we all went out and bought our own software, only to find out that we couldn't effectively communicate with each other. So there is a balance in all of this. And I think the key thing is, in the committee inserted some of the language in the NDAA, and that is to make sure that the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, which is led by the Vice Chairman and reports to me and the chiefs, is effectively, one, overseeing the requirements that are existing for capabilities, and also then the process for making sure that we meet those requirements in a timely manner, and those requirements are actually validated. And I think that's probably a key piece of it too, is the requirements. I think if you get the requirements right, and senior leadership is engaged in the requirements, and I say this both from the perspective of my current job as well as a former service chief, service leader engagement with the requirements, validating those requirements before we look at material and non-material solutions to those requirements, in my judgment, is the key to success. And that is something that I think has happened to a greater degree over the last couple of years, with the pressure in part that has been put on by this committee.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, General. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Beginning with, I know, General Dunford, you're a reader, and going back to the chairman's statements at the beginning of this hearing about the relationship between the military and civilian officials, I commend to you, although I suspect you have already read a dereliction of duty by your colleague, General McMaster, a stunning analysis of what not to do in terms of the relationship between civilian and military officials. You nodded. I assume that means you know the book.
Senator, I have read it.
And I think an additional one I would add to your list, it's a little bit longer, Barbara Tuchman's March of Folly, which takes us from Troy to Vietnam, again talking about relationships and how these mistakes are made. Which brings me to Korea. I have a queasy feeling that we're in 1914 stumbling towards Sarajevo, and what worries me is not an instantaneous nuclear confrontation, but an accidental escalation. Based upon the rhetoric that's going back and forth. The foreign minister of North Korea yesterday characterized our president's comments as a declaration of war. And he said, therefore, since the United States has declared war on our country, we will have every right to make countermeasures, including the right to shoot down United States strategic bombers, even when they are not in the airspace border of our country. That's what worries me, is a misinterpretation, misunderstanding, and an event, a shooting down of a bomber, a strike on a ship that leads to a countermeasure, and the end result is if Kim Jong-un feels his regime is under attack, then the unthinkable happens. Make me either feel better or worse about where we are.
Senator, I will make you feel better. I can tell you that I personally, the Secretary of Defense and Admiral Harris, are looking at all of our posture in managing risk on a day-to-day basis, informed by the need to avoid the risk of miscalculation. The recent operations that we conducted, I can assure you that even I was on the road. We probably, Secretary Mattis and I probably personally invested several hours each in reviewing those, to manage those, and without going into classified information here, to look at all of our capabilities, look at all their capabilities, look at timing, look at the probabilities
What
of
worries me
engagement.
about is misunderstanding and misinterpretation. What we view as an exercise, they may view as an imminent threat.
Senator, I guess what I'm suggesting to you is that where we conduct these exercises, we're informed by the North Korean posture at a given point in time. We're informed by the need to avoid miscalculation in an inadvertent engagement.
Do we have communication with North Korea with regard to these kinds of situations? This is just an exercise, for example.
We do not have military-to-military communications with North Korea right now.
Turning the North Korea question slightly, you testified earlier, and all the intelligence community agrees, that Kim Jong-un's primary motivation is regime survival. Therefore, it seems to me that statements that suggest regime change or regime destruction only solidify his determination to develop and maintain nuclear weapons. Would you agree?
Senator, I have been very careful at the military level to make no statements that would exacerbate the current crisis, and I certainly won't comment on things that our senior political leadership have said, but I certainly can tell you inside the military, we've made no statements, and we've had a conscious decision not to make any such statements to ensure that the lead right now is Secretary Tillerson, and the message that being delivered is primarily being delivered by the State Department.
But you do agree that the primary motivation for the development of the nuclear weapons is a kind of insurance policy for regime survival. Is that not the case?
That'd be my assessment, Senator.
Fine, thank you. What would be the practicality of a preemptive nuclear strike or a preemptive military strike on North Korea in terms of the military effect? Would it? There's some feeling, I hear somebody talked about a preemptive strike the other day, not in the administration, but on in this body. That would not be a short, easy action, would it not?
Senator, you bring up a good point, and part of the advice that I've provided to date is when we do something, we shouldn't assume at that point that we can control escalation. So we need to think about this in terms of what might happen as well as what we would want to happen.
And part of the problem is those artillery that are ranged across the North Korean border within Seoul, which is about as far as from here to Fairfax County.
That's right. The greater Seoul area, which has 25 million people, 250,000 Americans on any given day, it would be in Seoul, would certainly be threatened by the rockets and the missiles along the border.
So a military, the idea of a so-called surgical strike, to bring back a term from 40 years ago, is really not valid in this situation. It would not be, this is not something that would be easy to take out, for example, the nuclear capability of the North Koreans.
No, that's right, Senator. I mean, while we could do things that, from our perspective, it could be less than a full execution of an operations plan, we need to be informed by the potential risk to the greater Seoul area, no matter what we do on the peninsula. I think that's fair.
Thank you, General. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Committee to consider a list of 3,196 pending military nominations. All of these nominations have been before the committee.
Defensive aid to Ukraine.
I do, Senator, and have made that recommendation.
As I understand it, DOD has officially made an affirmative recommendation, and State Department also. So where is that decision, and can you enlighten the committee?
Senator, my understanding is that decision is at the White House.
And do you have any idea when we might be able to get an answer on that?
I don't, Senator. I will ask when we get back today. We've been asking for the last couple of weeks, but I'm not sure.
Well, I think it's very important that the Ukrainian government succeed in resisting further Russian expansion. Why did you recommend yes on providing lethal aid?
In my judgment, from a military perspective, the Ukraine needed additional capabilities to protect their sovereignty. As you probably know, Senator, in 2016, we trained a number of their battalions. 2017, trained additional battalions. We provided medical supplies, night vision goggles, counter-mortar radars, and other things. But we felt like their ability to stop armored vehicles and so forth would be essential to them to protect themselves. And so we just looked at it as a military gap that existed, that if that gap was filled, it would increase the probability the Ukrainians could defend themselves.
And I agree. I would just encourage members of the administration to move forward on that. With regard to Russia's asymmetric threats, such as information operations, cyber attacks, and jamming, I want to ask you specifically about the 173rd Airborne Brigade, which is said in a report to be under-equipped, undermanned, and inadequately organized. According to an Army review, 3 years after Crimea, why is this the case? Is it the case? And what can we do about it?
Senator, I read the media article and asked a couple of questions after I saw it. And I think what the leader was doing was describing, the current character of war and indicating that he believed that we ought to make some organizational changes and some equipment changes to make the 173rd base in Vicenza, Italy, more competitive. I think you could make that statement more broadly. So this was a leader looking at his particular unit. I think you can look at that statement more broadly and say that we need to adapt the U.S. military, really the entire U.S. government, to be able to compete at that level below war, where the Russians have so successfully integrated information operations, cyber, political influence, economic coercion, and information operations. So really, I think what the 173rd was describing is a force that is designed for conventional war, and in needing to make some organizational changes and add different capabilities to be competitive in the space that we're describing now.
So writ large, actually, this fairly accurate statement about the 173rd actually could be said about the entire Department of Defense. Is that what you're telling this committee?
Well, Senator, I think I would broaden it. What I would say is today, Russians, Chinese, and others are on a day-to-day basis doing what I describe as they are conducting adversarial competition at a level that falls below conflict. And they have integrated the entire government to be able to do that. And in my judgment, we need to improve our ability to compete in that space. And in the areas specifically I would mention from military capability would be our electronic warfare capability, our cyber capabilities, and our information operations capability. But those all have to be integrated with those things that we don't have inside the Department of Defense, of course, the economic and political tools. But in my judgment, bringing all those together on a day-to-day basis more effectively is something that we do need to do.
And finally, General, with regard to the 355 ship requirement, this is a requirement that's been developed by the generals and admirals in consultation with our leadership around the world. This committee, in the form of the NDAA, has put the Ships Act in the Senate-passed version. It makes the 355 ship requirement the policy of the United States Congress. The House of Representatives has also done that, and I expect this will be coming out of conference very soon. This requirement is, in fact, a serious requirement, is it not? And can you assure us that from the level of the administration, we're serious about getting to that number and getting and fulfilling that requirement rather than the 276 ships we have, and doing it as quick as practicable?
Senator, I don't think there's any question that all of us know that the Navy is smaller right now than it needs to be to meet all of those requirements. And that requirement that you've identified is one that's based on analytic rigor, and it should be a target that we shoot for. It'd be good to get there as soon as we can. And of course, many of the conversations we're having about the budget will inform our ability to do that. But we certainly appreciate your leadership in that regard.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Heinrich.
Thank you, Chairman McCain. Welcome, General Dunford. I want to follow up on Senator King's line of questioning with regard to North Korea. As you're aware, all 6 of North Korea's previous nuclear tests have occurred underground. That obviously contains the radioactive fallout. But Kim Jong-un has since threatened to conduct a test in the Earth's atmosphere. Can you talk a little bit about what the global risks and implications of a nuclear weapon detonated in the atmosphere would be, as Kim Jong-un is reportedly considering? And if you were speaking to the North Korean people right now, what would you say to them regarding the risks of detonating a nuclear weapon in the Earth's atmosphere?
No, Senator, I think the best experience we have recently, of course, would be the nuclear reactor in Russia some years ago and the incident that took place in Japan. And even with something that isn't anywhere near what the North Koreans are suggesting, we had significant health challenges for many, many years, and obviously the loss of life. It'd be an incredibly provocative thing for them to conduct a nuclear test in the Pacific as they have suggested. And I think the North Korean people would have to realize how serious that would be, not only for the United States, but for the international community.
I want to just take a quick moment to thank both you and Secretary Mattis for the sober and serious manner that you're approaching North Korea. I think that is the sort of temperament we need now more than ever. I want to shift gears real quickly. Our Commander of Special Operations, General Thomas, has said that the use of weaponized, commercially available drones by our adversaries was SOCOM's, quote, most daunting problem, end quote, in 2016. How serious is the threat, and can you explain why it's so difficult to deal with this threat with conventional weapons and kinetic means?
First, Senator, I agree with General Thomas's assessment, and that's the consistent feedback we have from our operational commanders. And in fact, about 4 months ago, we sent a team over, led by my J8, Lieutenant General Tony Ierti, to sit down with the commanders to make sure we had a full appreciation of what they were dealing with, so we can come back here and immediately send to them every single capability we possibly could. And we've made some progress in that regard in their ability to deal with this particular threat. But it's also going to require continued experimentation and adaptation to make sure that we stay out in front of the technology that the enemy has delivered. So this, we have seen them deliver chemical weapons. We've seen them deliver bombs. We've seen them be able to provide increased intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance against our partners on the ground largely. And so it does create a significant challenge, and we have done all we can do today to deal with that challenge, as well as develop the capabilities we'll need tomorrow. But I can assure you personally that has been exactly where General Thomas has suggested it should be, at the top of our list for current emerging threats in the current fight.
Well, I have to say I've been pleased to see the Pentagon respond so quickly with investments in laser technologies and other systems to address urgent needs like this one. Will you continue to support the Pentagon's use of rapid acquisition authorities provided by this committee to field new technologies like laser and high-power microwaves to help counter those drones and swarms?
I will, Senator. I think that having that capability has been one of the bright spots in what has been a largely criticized acquisition process.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think that directed energy on both of those fronts is a potential game changer for what's a rapidly developing situation with drones in particular. I want to return real quickly to an issue that Senator Kaine brought up earlier with regard to Puerto Rico. And you mentioned throughput, and one of the things that I understand is a bottleneck with throughput right now in that emergency response is the number of radars that are down and the fact that planes are landing, C-130s, et cetera, on VFR if there's not radar at various airfields. Does DOD have a role in restoring the radar at those airfields? Is that DHS? And what can you tell us about hopefully the easing of that bottleneck, which really limits how much we can get in there on a reasonable time period?
Senator, we do have the capability, and are right now, again, that's our priority, is focused on making sure the airfield operates. Pieces will be those expeditionary radars that we have, and we could provide as required on a short-term basis. The responsibility is primarily DHS at this point, We're not trapped in, bureaucratic niceties. What we're trying to do is make sure that we get the people of Puerto Rico the support they need when they need it. And the key thing that needs to be done right now, as you're suggesting, is all of the other support they need can't come in until we get the ports and airfields open.
Exactly
And so
right.
that's why Northern Command has placed that at the top of the list of support we're providing.
Thanks. Thank you very much, General Dunford.
On behalf of the Chairman McCain, Senator Perdue, please.
General Dunford, thank you for being here today. Thank you for you and your family for your service. I want to remind the committee that the first ship was, I believe, the USS Mercy in Port-au-Prince after the earthquake. And I want to thank the military on record here for always being the first in crisis like this in Puerto Rico. I want to highlight again a quote that was already referred to by the chairman this morning, because I think in February you called out this crisis. We have a global security crisis, but we have a debt crisis. And the two right now are, and you're the first one, I believe, to call this out. Your quote was, "Without sustained, sufficient, and predictable funding, I assess that within 5 years, we will lose our ability to project power, the basis of how we defend the homeland, advance U.S. interest, and meet our alliance commitments." Wow. Sir, that's a few months forward. Do you still stand by that assessment?
Senator, I do. And if I could just make a quick comment. I know many times the perception is that military leaders will never be satisfied with good enough and they'll always want more. And so somehow maybe people aren't looking at those comments with the seriousness that I intended them to be. I would not have made those comments without having gone on a long journey of analytic rigor to really, truly be able to quantify exactly what I'm talking about. I think we've shared with you, Senator, because of your interest, we've shared with you some of the results of our work. But those words are backed by a fairly exhaustive analytic effort that shows specific capability areas where we are in the process of losing our competitive advantage. And in the aggregate, when you go out 4 or 5 years, the loss of our competitive advantage in those specific areas means we will not be able to project power when and where necessary to advance our interests. That does two things. It not only affects our response to crisis, but it increases the probability there will be a crisis because it'll have an adverse effect on a deterrent capability of the U.S. military. I believe that one of the things that deters others today from a conventional conflict is their knowledge that we do have a competitive conventional advantage over any adversary today, and we can project power when and where necessary to advance our interests. Were we to lose that, I believe that there would be an increased possibility of conflict, particularly against our peer competitors.
Well, that's the question I have today for you, sir, is, if you look at the latest estimate, back in 2011, then Chairman Gates, Secretary of Defense then, made the estimate based on a bottoms-up estimate from the military on needs, and that estimate was, in today's dollars, for 2016, about $753 billion. Last year, we actually appropriated $623 only. That's all of Category 050, I believe. This year, it's going to be a little bit greater than that, 677 or thereabouts, but we're still significantly less than just what Secretary Gates wanted back then for 2016. That was before ISIS, Crimea, Ukraine, Syria, Iran, North Korea, and on and on and on, with Russia and China's growing capabilities. Sir, my question, and oh, by the way, you mentioned 3 to 7%. I don't disagree with that. I don't know what the need is, but I know that we are at a low point right now historically. I can look at the history. We've averaged over the last 30 years after Vietnam 4%. We're now at 3%. That 100 basis points is $200 billion. So any way you look at it today, my estimate is somewhere between 150 and 200 that we're short today, even with being $89 billion above the BCA. Sir, my question is, how do you determine the priorities going forward with that kind of shortfall? Because every dime that we're spending on the military today and on our veterans and on all domestic discretionary spending, let me say this again, every dime that we spend on our military and our veterans today, by definition, is borrowed money. In the last 8 years, and it's projected the next 10 years will be similar, we borrowed 35% of what we spent as a federal government. 25% of that spending is discretionary, and military is part of that. Sir, given all of that, you and Secretary Mattis have talked about the first step in the strategy is filling the hole. Are we on board doing that now with the appropriation this year? And what does the next 2 or 3 years look like in terms of trying to catch up with a number of years, not just the last 6 or 8, a number of years, 20 years even, of disinvesting in the military?
No, thanks, Senator. The way that we have characterized it in our recommendations is that we have readiness challenges. That's been described as the filling the holes. We have lethality challenges, and by that we mean areas like electronic warfare, cyber capability, our strike capability that needs to be improved. And then there's a capacity issue. And ideally, we'd be addressing all of those. We'd be addressing the current readiness of the force that we have. We'd be improving the capabilities we need for tomorrow, and we'd be increasing the capacity of the force to meet the overall requirements that we have. So the way we've chosen to prioritize it is to make sure that we, number one, make sure that the men and women today in those units that we're deploying have the wherewithal to accomplish the mission with minimal loss of life or equipment. That's job one. The second thing we're doing, and you saw this in the last 2 years, is starting to make increased investments, number one, in our nuclear enterprise, because deterring nuclear war is job one for the department, and then addressing some of these deficiencies in cyber capabilities, electronic warfare, ballistic missile defense, which we've spoken about. What we have not done is come in with a recommendation to increase the size or the capacity of the force, because in my judgment, we should not do that unless we can do it in a balanced way. And there's no way with the current level of resourcing we have and the projected level of resourcing that we can grow the force in a balanced way. So I think we're forced to fill the holes, address the readiness, and then do what we can to invest in the capabilities that we need to maintain competitiveness today and tomorrow. But I don't see in the near term our ability to really grow the force to get after the dynamic that has been discussed a bit this morning, where we have fewer ships than are necessary even to do ballistic missile defense on a day-to-day basis in the Pacific. And that's the challenge that we have, and that's kind of the three ways we think about it.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
On behalf of Chairman McCain, Senator Warren, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Dunford, good to see you here. So I want to ask you about the nuclear deal between the United States, the 5 partner nations, and Iran that has placed Iran's nuclear program under verifiable limits and unprecedented inspections so that it cannot develop a nuclear weapon. The Trump administration has already certified twice to Congress that Iran is complying with this agreement. If President Trump does not certify again by October 15th, he risks blowing up this agreement, and Iran may restart again building a nuclear weapon. Now, when asked about the Iran nuclear deal in January, Secretary Mattis told this committee that it is, quote, an imperfect arms control agreement. But he also said, quote, when America gives her word, we have to live up to it and work with our allies. General, do you agree with that?
Senator, I do, and my recommendation the previous 2 times was informed by that and the fact that the intelligence community had determined that there was not a material breach to the JICPOA. And so what I recommended is that we focus leveraging our partners that were part of that agreement to deal with those other challenges that we know Iran poses, whether it's the terrorist threat, the maritime threat, and so forth.
Well, you know, this is always the issues. Iran supports terrorism, engages in human rights abuses, works to develop ballistic missiles. But I think it's easier to counter Iran's destabilizing behavior if it has no nuclear weapon than it would be to keep Iran in check if it had access to a nuclear bomb. So the question I have is, aside from the current nuclear deal, at this time, are you aware of any alternative binding diplomatic agreement that would prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon?
I am not, Senator. I would highlight, though, the one thing we all have to come to grips with is there is a sunset to the current JICPOA, and that needs to be addressed in the near term.
It certainly does. But for right now, it appears that the Iran deal is working. There is no viable alternative, and it sounds like we need to keep enforcing this deal to keep us all safe. I want to ask you another question, and that is about North Korea. You know, most of the time the discussion centers on the role of China, but I want to ask about Russia's relationship, which is also critical to influencing the North Korean regime. Russia has completed a railroad linking the two countries. A ferry now operates between Russia and North Korea. Vladimir Putin wrote off 90% of North Korea's $11 billion debt to Russia. State Department estimates that North Korea sends about 20,000 workers to Russia annually, which produces foreign currency that Kim Jong-un desperately needs. And while we're trying to pull the international community together to try to persuade North Korea to stand down on nuclear weapons, reports emerged last week that fuel shipments between Russia and North Korea are increasing. So, General Dunford, I want to ask, beyond our existing sanctions and authorities, what more should we be doing to counter Russia's support for North Korea?
Senator, I do believe that the solution to what's going on with Russia and China is diplomatic at this point. And economic, to the degree that sanctions and second and third order sanctions can be implemented. I don't think there is, at this point, a military dimension to the challenge of getting better cooperation from Russia and China. But I do believe that the things that Secretary Tillerson has proposed to do and what Secretary Mnuchin has implemented over the past couple of months may be affecting the calculus of Russia and China, although I think we're a long way from determining whether or not the path we're on will result in peaceful denuclearization, which, of course, is what we all want to see.
So let me ask you, to put this question, though, in a larger frame. You know, Russia seems to intervene in a lot of places in opposition to the United States, Syria, Afghanistan, North Korea. Can you just say a word about how you see Putin's larger strategy here?
I think that there's very few places that I could look at in the world, Senator, where U.S. and Russian interests align. And I think in many cases what they're trying to do, if you start in Europe, their primary focus is to undermine the credibility of the NATO alliance. If you look across the Middle East, they're trying to undermine the partnerships that we have and erode the confidence in our partners of the U.S. commitment to the region. And I think by the same token, they're trying to play a spoiler role and achieve undue influence in the issue on the Korean Peninsula that you spoke about a minute ago. So I can't think of too many places where Russia is playing a helpful role right now, from the Maghreb to the Middle East to North Korea.
Yeah, I just think it's so critical as we talk about our alliances around the world that we recognize exactly this point, that Russia's doing everything it can to break up those alliances, to sow discord in those alliances, and the importance of our keeping them together, and the importance of holding Russia accountable for what it's doing with North Korea.
Senator, if I could just make a quick comment on that.
Please.
I mean, when we developed the national military strategy that we have right now, we determined that the strength of the U.S. military was our allies and partners and the network we built up since World War II. Not only Russia, but others recognize that that's our source of strength. And so there's a concerted effort to undermine those allies and partners. And so what we should be doing at this point is doubling down our efforts to maintain strong alliances and partnerships, because that is the key to success.
Good. Thank you very much, General.
On behalf of Chairman McCain, Senator Sullivan, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and General, congratulations to you, sir, and your family. For your decades of exceptional service. I look forward to supporting your swift reconfirmation. I wanted to turn to an issue that you and I have talked a lot about in the NDAA. I had a provision in there this year that talked about our FONOPS policy and how we should be looking at regular, routine, and if possible, with allies. So in some ways, our FONOPS, particularly in the South China Sea, are no longer newsworthy. Can you elaborate a bit on the department's FONOPS policy and if this differs from the previous administration? For example, you know, it was reported that Admiral Harris essentially had to get individual FONOPS approved by the NSC one at a time under the Obama administration. What's the strategy right now under the Trump administration, and how does that differ?
No, Senator, thanks. That is a good question. Secretary Mattis, when he came in early February, we went to him with a couple of individual freedom of navigation operations that you spoke about. And he said, hey, look, how about give me a full strategy that lays this thing out now for a long period of time and talks about the strategic effect we're trying to achieve. You spoke about partners. You talk about being routine and regular. And so those are the things that Secretary Mattis directed. After that, Admiral Harris developed a long-term plan for freedom of navigation operations, and that's what we're implementing right now as a strategic approach to freedom of navigation operations that does in fact support our overall strategy in the Pacific, as well as the specific mission, which is to ensure that we fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows, and we continue to validate those claims where we see international airspace, for that matter, or the maritime domain.
So those are going well, regular, routine, with our allies if possible, not micromanaged from the NSC?
That's right. And Senator, in candor, we still and always will take into account what else is happening in the strategic environment, whether it's a UN General Assembly or some other event. But we do have a base plan from which we're operating right now in a healthy defense.
Let me turn to missile defense. You've had a lot of questions today. I think is it safe to say that the administration views a much more robust missile defense as a key part of our strategy with regard to North Korea or Iran, with regard to rogue nations like those two countries that are trying to acquire intercontinental ballistic nuclear missiles?
No question, Senator.
So you mentioned the NDAA does a lot. We do, but I think there's more that we should be doing. Does the administration have plans to, at least from a supplemental perspective or working with the Congress, beefing up our missile defense? I think it's something we all agree, it's very bipartisan, by the way, that we need to be doing. What are more specifics, General, you could share with us on what we need to be doing, and how can Congress support you?
Sure, Senator, we did do exactly as you suggest, and we've submitted it. And if you don't have a copy of that, I'll make sure you get one. But we looked at additional radar systems. We looked at THAAD systems, Patriot systems. As you know, in the NDAA, there's additional interceptors, additional 21, I think is the number that I recall, that are in there. All of those issues are part of it. We did an immediate kind of supplemental, for, just as your suggestion, for ballistic missile defense. I think it was maybe the first or second week of August to make sure it was in time for the budget cycle. So I think what you have outlined in the NDAA, combined with the supplemental that the administration has put together, will meet the immediate needs. But of course, we need a long-term strategic approach to ballistic missile defense, and buying the same capabilities that we have today into the future is not going to be the solution as the threat adapts. And I know you've received some of the classified briefings on the adaptations of the threat, which means our ballistic missile defense capabilities also have to adapt.
Well, we want to work with you on that. I think it's an area, like I said, of bipartisan cooperation in the Congress, which is new but important development, and we want to work with the administration on that. Let me end, just a final question. I really want to applaud you and General Mattis, the entire administration, Secretary Tillerson, on the North Korea strategy. I think what you're trying to achieve, your focus on it, importantly, your frequent and constructive engagement with Congress, asking us to play our part, have also been very, very an important element of that strategy. I also believe that you talk a lot about credible military options, and that, to me, is an effective element of our diplomacy. Effective diplomacy, which I think we're starting to see a lot of progress in that realm. If one of the options was a preemptive or preventive ground war on the Korean Peninsula, like the Gulf War in 1990 or 2003 that was launched by the U.S., my view is that would require an AUMF from the Congress, and constitutionally and politically, this would help our policy with regard to leverage, with regard to the ability to show the world that the American people were behind that. Do you agree with that? And is that something that the administration has started to talk about? I've raised it with a number of folks. I think it's an important issue. We want to be supportive. I think you're getting bipartisan support for what the strategy is. But that kind of issue, to me, is something that we need to be prepared to discuss. Do you have a view on that, General?
Senator, I think what I do is probably narrow my view to the scenario you're describing. I would want to have the full-throated support of the American people in the form of the Congress if we did something like you're suggesting.
Right, and I use that language very carefully. I know the President has a lot of authority to react, to take action, particularly if we're attacked, but I'm talking about a ground war a la 1950, launched by the United States, although in 1950, as you know, there was no congressional authorization. I think that's an important topic. I think it gives us leverage, and I'm glad to see that you believe that for something like that, you would want that. And I don't want to put words in your mouth.
No,
It's an important
Senator,
issue.
I think again, we know from history that we are going to be much better degree of success if we have the full-throated support of the American people when we go to war. What you're suggesting is going to war. And,
Correct.
And if we're going to conduct a major war, then having the full support of the American people in the form of the Congress, I think, is something we need to have.
Thank you. Thank you, General.
On behalf of Chairman McCain, Senator Nelson.
General Mattis, General Dunford, you have certainly my confidence in you. And the reason I said General Mattis, I also have that confidence in General Mattis, and I also have that confidence in General Kelly. Is there something about Marines that inspires confidence?
Senator, in my current assignment, I don't think you want me to answer that question, do you?
No.
Thank you, sir.
Vladimir Putin cannot beat us on land. He can't beat us on the sea. He can't beat us under the sea. He can't beat us in the air. And he can't beat us in space. But he can beat us in cyber. You want to comment on that, how our forces are organized to deter and counter?
Thanks, Senator. I mean, I would agree with your assessment that the most significant threat in cyberspace we face today, the most advanced capabilities are the Russians. That's our assessment. I would argue, though, that it's not only his cyber capability. The one thing that the Russians have effectively done is combine that cyber capability with political influence operations, economic coercion, information operations, electronic warfare, and even military posture. And if you take those 4 or 5 things and you look at the centralized command and control system that Russia has, even playing an overall weak hand, as you've described each of the domains where we have dominance, even with an overall weak hand, they've been able to effectively advance their interests without going to war. And I do believe that that's an area that not only should we be focused on in the department, in our recent global campaign plans now have added what I call competition, adversarial competition, short of armed conflict as being an area that is included in our campaign plans. But I also believe we need to take a look at that from a whole of government perspective as well in order to be competitive.
Absolutely. Because you know what he can do in the next election. He doesn't, and the newspapers have reported that he's already in several states' registration records. All he has to do is particular critical precincts go in and eliminate every 10th voter. You can imagine the chaos that would occur on Election Day if the voters get there and, I'm sorry, Mr. Jones, you're not registered. That would be significantly disruptive to our infrastructure and to the underpinnings of our country, a free and fair election. The president's budget makes significant funding cuts in the Department of State and USAID. Does that make sense to you?
What I can say is, Senator, that there's no challenge that I'm currently dealing with that the primary factors in our success won't be diplomatic, economic, and certainly even in our campaign in Iraq and Syria, USAID plays a critical role in stabilization to secure the gains that our partners are making on the ground in Syria and Iraq as one example. But every place I've been over the past 15 or 16 years in Iraq and Afghanistan, a key partner has been USAID.
Well, and as you all, as military commanders, you also project American power in the forms of using so many of our other agencies of government. so that you become not only a warrior as a military commander, you become a diplomat as well, utilizing those other levers of power. We've seen that used very effectively by your respective commanders in Africa, likewise again in Latin America. And if you don't have those other agencies, and I just mentioned two, state and USAID, it clearly clips your wings in being able to function as a military commander. Any further comment on that?
Senator, I think I'd probably just reinforce the one point that today, any of our military commanders, to be successful, have got to achieve unity of effort with the other government agencies that are on the ground. And you mentioned two, but if I think of our Afghanistan experience, the FBI was there, the DEA was there, Customs Border Police was there. So I agree with the thesis that the challenges that we face today are complex contingencies, and they require elements of all of our government in order to be successful. And so trying to draw a distinction between the security of our nation in one department is not possible today. Many departments in our government are all involved in the fundamental task of government, which is security.
And General, thank you also to your family for the sacrifices that they have made over the years and allowing him to continue to serve his country, and for you all continuing to serve the country in the role that you have, which is substantial. Thank you.
On behalf of Chairman McCain, Senator Green, please.
Thank you, General Dunford, for your service. Why should I vote for you?
Senator, over the past 2 years, I think I have provided best military advice.
Okay, you've got me. In the next 2 years, don't you agree that sequestration needs to be fixed or we're going to go backwards?
It does, Senator.
Do you agree with me if you don't reform entitlements over the arc of time, there's no money left to do anything other than entitlements?
Senator, I've seen the math, and we're headed towards a situation where it's going to be very difficult.
Yeah, so entitlement reform is necessary to keep a strong military. I want to look at the threats going forward in the next 2 years. Do you agree that there must be a credible military option on the table when it comes to North Korea?
I do, Senator, and I've personally conveyed that to our to China and to our allies in the region.
Do you agree with me that Iran has taken the money from the Iranian nuclear agreement and done more damage with it than good?
There are indicators that some money that was freed up as a result of JCPOA has been put back into malign activities, and certainly I'd be hard-pressed to find anything that Iran does that is good.
So the goal of the agreement was to get them back into the family of nations. Would you say thus far that has not been achieved?
Iran is not part of the family of nations today, Senator.
Okay. Syria. Do you agree with me that if we leave Assad in power, it's going to be very difficult to end this war?
Senator, I've looked at Syria, as you can imagine, pretty hard, and I think addressing the grievances of the civil war are going to be necessary to have a stable political construct.
Okay. In terms of Russia, over the last 6 months, have they gotten better, worse, or about the same?
In Syria, Senator?
Anywhere? Everywhere?
They certainly haven't gotten any better anywhere.
Okay. There may be evidence that Russia was more deeply involved in sending out fake news during our last election. Does that trouble you?
It troubles me, Senator, although I don't have any unique insight into it.
Okay. Afghanistan, the recent decision to add more capability with rules of engagement changes. Do you think that is necessary to be continued?
I think it is necessary, Senator, and I think it will help to get the Afghan security forces to reverse the trends of the last 2 years, casualties and the lost ground that they have experienced. I think what this additional effort will allow us to do is provide more effective advisory effort down to the tactical level with the Afghans, and also better leverage the air support that we have, and we have increased the air support as well.
And there's a new emphasis on Pakistan where they need to be a better part of the team?
That's exactly right, Senator. There's a key assumption in in the President's South Asia strategy that Pakistan cannot continue to be a sanctuary for Haqqani, Taliban, and others, and we have success.
Would you agree with me that we have to have very skilled ambassadors representing our country in both Pakistan, Afghanistan, and India to get a good outcome militarily?
I would agree, Senator, and I was very encouraged, and I think you were on a committee that we confirmed Ambassador Bass to go to Afghanistan. I've got a good experience with him in Turkey. I've watched him deal with difficult situations, so I think we have the right man headed to Afghanistan.
So in Iraq, it's just a matter of time till we clear ISIL out of Iraq. Do you agree with that?
I believe the Iraqi security forces are on a pretty good trajectory right now to clear out ISIS.
As you look forward in Iraq, if the Iraqis would accept a follow-on force, do you believe it is our national security interest this time to leave some troops behind to continue to work with the Iraqis?
I do, Senator. I think there's a large recognition, both in Iraq and certainly for the coalition partners that are there, that continued training of the Iraqi security forces is going to be necessary for them to become self-sustaining. Obviously, the decision is going to have to be a political decision between the Iraqi government and the U.S. government, but from a military perspective, I certainly believe that that's necessary.
And finally, do you agree if the world is seen as capitulating to Kim Jong-un, the United States, but the world at large, that the Iranians will watch and have a different view of where they should be going?
Well, I think all the nations that I would consider adversaries or potential adversaries will watch closely what's happening on the Korean Peninsula.
And finally, it's the policy of this administration to deny the North Korean regime the ability to develop an ICBM with a nuclear weapon on top to hit the American homeland. Not contain it, but deny it. Is that correct?
That is the articulated policy of President Trump.
Do you agree with that policy?
I do, Senator.
Thank you, and I look forward to your service for the next 2 years. Our men and women in the military could not be in finer hands. Thank you and your family.
Thank you, Senator.
On behalf of Chairman McCain, let me recognize Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. General Dunford, first of all, thank you for your service and to your family as well. I would like to focus just briefly on Puerto Rico. You were asked about it earlier. Is there more that the Department of Defense can do to provide assistance in the midst of this humanitarian crisis, which involves not only human suffering, but also the interruption for some period of time of communications, of travel, logistics, the lifeblood in terms of infrastructure of the island? Is there more that the military can do?
Senator, if there is, we'll be doing it. We're in a constant, first of all, I couldn't agree with you more, and we've watched the tragedy unfold here over the last few days. The last update I had, not just to come over here, but just because that's how constant we're getting updated, was an update on our efforts in Puerto Rico. To date, what they've identified are the things that would allow us to open the airfields, open the ports, and get that immediate electricity, fresh water, and food to the people in Puerto Rico. But if there is more that needs to be done, I can assure you that Secretary Mattis has placed Puerto Rico as a priority for all of us, and General Robinson is in constant contact with FEMA as well as officials in Puerto Rico to make sure the department is leaning forward and providing all the support that they need.
The National Guard of Connecticut, and I think of other states, have been involved in transportation. The airfields are now open to military aircraft and relief flights. Do you anticipate that military aircraft can and will be used more extensively in this effort?
I do, Senator. That's absolutely part of the plan, particularly, again, for generators, water, food, those kind of immediate needs.
Would you anticipate that the Corps of Engineers can play a role in opening some of the ports, perhaps some of the other means of transportation that could be involved?
Senator, I don't know whether it be specifically the Corps of Engineers or some of our combat engineers, but I do believe that the military is uniquely capable of helping to clear the debris and get the airfields, repair the airfields and get them up and operating. And I can assure you, whatever capabilities are required in that regard, whether they're resident inside the Corps of Engineers or resident in some of our other operational units, we'll make sure that the right capability is at the right place.
And the Department of Defense is indeed leaning forward and prepared, ready, able, and willing to provide whatever assistance is necessary.
Absolutely, Senator. These are Americans, and we're going to do everything we can to help them out.
And they are Americans.
They are Americans, Senator.
Let me ask you about the recent exercises conducted by Russia. I think they were called Zapad West with Belarus. Are there any sort of lessons or other intelligence that we've gained that you can discuss in this forum from having observed those exercises?
Senator, probably be, if you don't mind, reluctant to discuss it in public. I was just with a meeting of all 29 NATO chiefs of defense last weekend. This, as you can imagine, was one of the topics. And then I came back out through Norway with my Norwegian counterpart to talk more specifically about challenges on the northern flank of NATO and some of the things we've seen in the exercise. But I can assure you, we watch very carefully what the Russians have done during Operation Zapad to make sure that we understand where they are in terms of capability development and what the implications are for NATO security and for U.S. security.
And despite the Russian efforts to drive wedges in our NATO alliance among our allies, would you say that the NATO alliance is in good health right now?
Senator, I would, and I certainly now have probably a 5-year perspective from 2 out of my last 3 assignments directly involved with NATO. And I would even say in the last year, a year ago, there was a strong debate inside of NATO about 360-degree security and almost a different view from those nations that viewed the South and the terrorist threat as being the priority, and those nations that viewed Russia as being a priority. And I think over the past year, with some very strong leadership, and I think the Secretary General has been a part of that, I feel much better today about the cohesiveness of NATO and about the recognition that it's not either or of those threats, it's both, and that nations need to make the significant contributions to prepare us for both of those challenges. So I think the overall health of NATO is actually, I would assess to be very strong.
Thank you. My time has expired, but I just want to say I will be strongly and enthusiastically supporting you for another term. And again, my thanks for your service and as well to your family. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
On behalf of Chairman McCain, Senator Shaheen, please.
Well, thank you. I think I'm the last one, so hopefully we will be quick. General Dunford, thank you to you and your family for your willingness to continue to serve in this role. I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of support on this committee for your nomination. On Friday, it was reported that the KC-46 aerial refueling tanker program was hit with 3 Category 1 deficiencies, including one that was reported as possibly jeopardizing the willingness of the Air Force to accept the aircraft from Boeing. How concerned are you about those deficiencies, and are you worried that we won't be able to take delivery of those aircraft by the scheduled time of spring of 2018?
Senator, what I am concerned about is the delivery of the tankers and the capability that would imply a capability gap. I think if you had the transportation commander here, General McDough, today, he would talk to you about tankers as being one of his more significant challenges in meeting all of our requirements. So I'm not familiar with the details of these deficiencies, and it hasn't been translated into time for me at this point. But I think with regard to the capability itself, that is one of the more critical capabilities in a joint force, and all of our plans are based on our ability to meet this requirement.
Well, absolutely, and I'm sure, I assume you would give us your commitment that you will follow up and find out how serious those deficiencies are and whether they jeopardize the scheduled time frame for delivery.
I will, Senator.
Thank you. You talked about the importance of electronic warfare and of coordinating those efforts, and also there have been several back and forths about Russia and its hybrid capabilities and how important that is to its current capacity to engage. Can you talk about how the military is looking at our electronic and cyber tools and how we're working with other departments within the federal government, Treasury, State, to coordinate those efforts?
Right. Senator, obviously primarily focused on defending the information technology of the department as well as select industrial pieces that support the department. So that's our primary focus. And then defending the nation, which includes a suite of offensive capabilities. So being able to exploit in cyberspace, being able to conduct offensive operations and defensive operations are all a piece of it. But with regard to collaboration and cooperation, the one area that Admiral Rogers and his team are very focused on is when a vulnerability is identified, the sharing and the action taken to address those vulnerabilities is an important piece. And that's going to require not only, as you suggest, great cooperation within the government, and I think we're in a pretty good place in that regard, but it's also going to require great public-private cooperation as well, so that when that assistance is offered, it's accepted and there's a degree of trust that what we're trying to do is actually help them mitigate the risk of vulnerabilities. That's probably one of the key areas of cooperation. And as you know, Senator, you've paid close attention to this issue. There's always a debate about what agency within our government is best capable of performing what mission. I think that dialogue will go on for many years to come, and we're always refining it, and we should be. We shouldn't be comfortable or complacent that we have it exactly right, and that dialogue is ongoing, not only about the organizational construct of Cyber Command itself, but also the department's role within the broader government effort.
I certainly agree with that. However, I do think it's important for us to have someone within the administration who is the point person on cyber activities. Is there somebody that you're aware of who's actually the person in charge of those activities?
Senator, I can't say that there is. It doesn't mean that there isn't. I'm not aware of somebody right now in the administration who's designated. I probably and incorrectly have a decidedly DOD perspective right now, but I'll certainly find out.
Well, thank you. I think it says something that, as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, you're not aware of who the person is who's in charge. You also talked about the importance of our alliances and partnerships and how that contributes to how Russia and our other adversaries view the strength of the United States. Do you have any sense of what the reaction would be among our partners with the JCPOA if the United States were to abrogate our commitments under that treaty?
Senator, I don't have any unique insights into that, but I certainly know what everybody else knows from the open source, and I don't think there'd be unanimity of those who were part of the JCPOA were we to walk away.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you for your willingness to continue to serve.
Thanks, Senator.
Thank you. On behalf of Chairman McCain, Senator Peters, please.
Thank you, Senator Reid. General Dunford, again, thank you for your testimony here today. Thank you for your service to our country. But I also just want to thank you for your thorough answers that you always give to our questions. They're very candid, and not only your willingness to answer those questions here in a formal setting, but you've always been accessible to us on a one-on-one basis to answer specific questions, and I appreciate that immensely. General Dunford, I know that the department is concerned about the geopolitical implications of mega cities, including the growth of cities of over 10 million people. I spoke with Admiral Harris about this when he testified earlier this year. Admiral Harris testified that there are 10 megacities in the world, with 8 of them in the Pacific Command area of responsibilities. And these locations are ripe to become geopolitical hotspots, given the number of people involved and some of the unique political context that they are associated with them. So the ability of the services to operate in these very dense urban environments are going to become increasingly important, both in contingency and conflict as well as humanitarian assistance. We have particular concerns about Seoul, given the threats of that are now associated with North Koreans' action, and Seoul is obviously one of those mega cities that we need to be concerned about, and also raises a host of other issues when it comes to dealing with that. If you could address plans that we have for dealing in mega cities, how you plan to deal with that issue, and are there needs for us to invest additional training and not only of the soldiers and Marines, but also developing tactics and procedures that we need to go forward that we should be assisting you in from a congressional perspective?
Senator, I could, and I think the core of what we're doing to prepare for that is found in our exercise, in our experimentation program, and it also reflects in the priorities that we'd have for innovation. And so if you take a look at our exercise and experimentation program, it is focused on our ability to deal in a very complex, dense urban terrain. I think all of us have looked at the demographics. We looked at where people will live. We looked at where the sources of conflict will be, and in preparing ourselves accordingly to do that. There's some unique challenges in megacities. Command and control is one of those challenges. Intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance is one of those challenges. Minimizing collateral damage while delivering effective fires are one of those challenges, and those are all areas within the department that we are working on.
And please let us know if there's anything else we can do to help you provide the resources necessary, because I think it's obvious that's going to be an area that we're going to have to be dealing with in the future without question.
Thanks, Senator.
When you were asked a previous question about things not to assume in a future war, at the top of the list was our ability to dominate in space. And so I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, and in particular what we're seeing with the Chinese that seem to be developing. At least evidence suggests that they're developing as many as 3 different ASAT capabilities and have conducted multiple tests in space of direct ascent ASAT systems. They also established a new service a few years ago to make that capability even more robust. You could address how concerned we should be, and from a congressional perspective, do we need to be putting more resources into this critical area?
Senator, thanks. When we fielded the current space capabilities, we didn't field them with resilience to the current threat in mind. And so they are vulnerable to the threats that you spoke about. And not only the Chinese, but the Russians and others recognize that. Even North Korea has a nascent anti-space program that's there. And if you look at our dependencies in space, whether it's the timing of our systems, global prepositioning, our command and control systems militarily, or the dependence on our economy on space capabilities, the vulnerabilities in space, which we really identify in the budget as a need for increased resilience in space to those threats, the vulnerabilities have significant implications, not only from a military perspective, but from a commercial perspective as well. So certainly part of our budget is designed to enhance our resilience in space and also enhance the redundancies and the access that we have to a wide range of space capabilities so that we minimize the threat that you've identified. As a result of that analysis and recognition, probably the last 3 years, you have seen increased requests from the department for space-related capabilities. Again, my priority at this point would be on space resilience, but there's a wide range of other capabilities we need as well. And that, again, is informed by the developing threat, military threat to space capabilities that we have.
And if I may add, the point that you made, it's not just our military satellites. We need to be working with some of our commercial suppliers of communication satellites and other space technologies. We should be stepping up our activities working with the commercial sector, I would assume.
Absolutely, Senator. In fact, one of the areas that we believe there's some potential is to better leverage commercial activities, for example, to expand our intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capability.
Great. Thank you, General. Appreciate it.
General, thank you for your service, selfless service to the Marine Corps and to the nation, and thank your family for their service alongside you. And on behalf of Chairman McCain, I would declare the hearing adjourned. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Senator.